Okay. Um, Welcome everybody to the Global New Voices. I'm joined by Tom Metcalf, who's my co-host for this. And Christina Bradstreet is the head of programming for the Association for Art History, and she is taking care of all the coordination she's done. I know that even though she is relatively new to the role, she has done a host of presentations of this kind. So thank you very much, Christina. To let you all know then, the DCR committee is actually the committee for doctoral and early career research researchers. So this is an event really to provide support and a platform for current PhD and some master's students and early researchers within 5 years of their receiving their PhD generally. So this conference gives a voice to PhD researchers, and it runs annually. This is the second year that I've been running this conference, but I know that it's been going on for 3 or 4 years, I think now. So before introducing our first speaker, a couple of housekeeping rules, a few housekeeping rules. All participants are muted except for the speakers. And we are recording this event, although we're not recording attendees, and some papers won't be recorded at the request of the presenters. So just so that you know, if you have any questions, and there'll be 5 to 10 minutes after each presentation for questions, please post them in the Q&A, and I or Tom will pick up on them, and if there's time, put them to the presenter. For people who are presenting papers and show artist showcases, which is a new feature this year, and also Petra Kuchas, which I'll explain when it comes to it. Please leave time for questions, and do stick to the timings. And that's it, really, I think now. That took me 5 minutes, so I'm ahead of the schedule. I'm going to start then by introducing our esteemed first keynote speaker of the morning, Eko Eschen. Eko, would you like to put on your... Brilliant, thank you. He's the chairman of the Fourth Plinth, overseeing the public art program in the UK. He used to be the director of the Institute for Contemporary Art in London, the ICA. He was awarded the 2023 Association for Art History's Curatorial Prize, and this was for In the Black Fantastic at the Hayward Gallery. And he's also authored some books, Black Gold of the Sun and Africa State of Mind. A cultural polymath is how The Guardian have described you. And I know that you've also written, and presented the BBC documentary Dark Matters, a history of the Afrofuture. So I'm delighted, it's a Tate Modern. So I'm delighted then to introduce you and to hear more about your experience in the Black Fantastic, curating the exhibition. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sophie. So I'll go to, shall I share some slides while we're talking? Let me just do that. Let's go to share screen. Go. Can we see that? Yeah, can we see that? Good. Okay. I'm also coming to you from a hotel room in Edinburgh at the moment, hence the slightly kind of rococo backdrop behind us. But look, I'm just going to talk for a little bit about In the Black Fantastic as an exhibition. This is an exhibition that I curated at the Hayward Gallery last summer. The show was the UK's first major exhibition dedicated to the work of Black artists who engage with the speculative and the mythic in their work, who draw inspiration from African-originated beliefs and knowledge systems as a way to address racial injustice, explore other ways of seeing, other realities. So the show featured a range of artists, including Nick Cave, whose work we see here, Wangechi Mutu, Chrysophylle, Lunaris ficta. And I just want to talk through, I suppose, some of the underlying themes within the work. I suppose my proposition with the exhibition was that in all the work of these artists, Wangechi, Cave, Chrysophylle, and so on, we see something similar in place. We see a similar merging of the spiritual, the science fictional, the supernatural. This is the kind of starting ground, the matter, the territory of the Black Fantastic. I started work on the show because I noticed this tendency for me that was starting to prevail within aspects of contemporary art, but also beyond visual art. I could see some of the same tendencies at play in pop culture, in movies like Black Panther, in moving image, in music works like Beyonce's Lemonade. In all these instances, I felt we could see Black culture straining beyond the quotidian, reaching beyond the everyday, addressing some sense of the speculative and the mythic. So in making the show, I called this tendency, this territory, the Black Fantastic. And just to think about that for a moment, by the Black Fantastic, what I mean and wanted to talk about are works of speculative fiction that draw from history and myth to conjure new visions of African diasporic culture and identity. In framing that, I used the scholar Rosemary Jackson's description of the fantastic as a form that reaches beyond the boundaries of realism and dispenses with what she called rigid distinctions between animate and inanimate objects, between self and other, life and death. The fantastic, says Rosemary Jackson, undoes and reconfigures the cultural order of society and represents the unspoken desire for change. It involves inverting elements of this world, recombining its constitutive features, new relations, in order to produce something strange, something unfamiliar, and apparently new. So to this definition, I wanted to add that the Black Fantastic also begins from an understanding of race as a socially constructed fiction rather than a scientific truth. There's no physical, genetic, biological difference between people of different colors other than skin color. Nevertheless, the idea of race remains a persistent notion, one of the determining ways that we understand our place in the world. The Black Fantastic also operates with a skepticism about Western narratives of progress and modernity, civilization and technological advancement, all of which historically have been predicated on the subjugation of peoples of color. We can go back to the Enlightenment in the 18th century, which in many ways forms the basis of the liberal, tolerant, progressive, modern world that we live in today. The Enlightenment, its notions of order and rationality, were predicated also on a binary. So while the Enlightenment and thinking from then onwards posits the West as the center point for progress, development, civilizational advancement, that also exists in a binary. So in opposition to those notions of advancement, we also have notions of the uncivilized, the savage, the brutish, the primitive, which historically and certainly in the Enlightenment imagination rested in chiefly in Africa. People of color were a repository for ideas of, or binaries of civilized versus primitive, modern versus traditional, scientific versus superstitious. Hegel talked in the 18th century, Hegel said, in Negro life, consciousness has not yet attained to the realization of any substantial objective existence. African people, said Hegel, were representative of natural man in his completely wild and untamed state. Immanuel Kant said something similar. He said, the Negro can be disciplined and cultivated, but is never genuinely civilized. He falls of his own accord into savagery. What I find fascinating and depressing at the same time is how this legacy of fantastic othering persists to the present day in the ways that Black people remain demonized and dehumanized in the popular Western imagination. Here we can think of a few things. For example, we can think of the history of lynchings in the United States. We can think, remaining within the US, we can think of the savage beating of Rodney King in the 1990s. We can think most recently of the murder of George Floyd. All of these incidents predicated on a projection upon Black people as people who are other, who are alien, who are brutish, who are savage, who are less than human. So the question becomes, I would suggest, how do we, as Black people, live? How should we survive within this system? How should we survive when we as Black people, when our living means living within a fantasy not of our own making, when our reality is someone else's fantasy? How do we live? My proposition would be, the proposition of Black Fantastic is that we do so by conjuring our own fantasies, not as a means to escape, but in order to grapple with the horror of the racialized everyday, in order to make sense of it and predicate this on our own terms. Now, what does that construction of fantasy look like? What might it look like? Let's go back into history for a moment. The year is 1803. In May 1803, a slave ship reaches towards the coast of Georgia in America. The ship has arrived from the west coast of Africa, from what we know today as Nigeria. It's nearing its final destination. On board are 75 captive men and women belonging to the Igbo people of modern-day Nigeria. As the ship approaches America, the captive people on board stage a revolt. They manage to take control of the ship. They throw overboard the white captain and crew. However, the ship continues to move and it runs aground on the coast of a place called St. Simon's Island, which is an island off the coast of Georgia. The Igbo people on board the ship face a choice. They face the prospect of either being captured and returned into captivity now that the ship has run aground on the coast, or they can make another choice. So, still in chains, they choose to resist, and in a collective action of mass suicide, they walk into the water and are drowned. Now, this is a true story. It takes place in 1803. but in the subsequent years and decades and centuries, in fact, since then, this story has acquired a powerful resonance as a form of myth. Since then, since 1803, there has been talk and shared supposition and imagining about the fate and the legacy of these people. This has coalesced into what's now known as the legend of the Flying Africans, which is a story that's been repeated in the Caribbean and southern states of America, elsewhere across the African diaspora, in which it is said that instead of walking to their death in the water, these people together collectively raised their arms and took flight into the sky and flew back to Africa across the water. So this story of death and resistance takes on another resonance as a story of fantastic imagining of life beyond life as an insistent path away from subjugation, away from exploitation. And the legend of the Flying Africans has been reimagined many times, not just as a kind of folkloric tale, as it originally was, but in contemporary culture. So we can think about that. If you read Toni Morrison's book, The Song of Solomon, this ends with one of the central characters raising his arms, flying back to Africa in direct homage to the legend of the Flying Africans. We might look too to Julie Dash's extraordinary film from 1993, Daughters of the Dust, which is set on St. Simon's Island on the same ground that the original slave ship originally ran aground, and conjures a territory of myth and dreaming in early 20th century Southern America. Equally, we might look to Beyonce's Lemonade, which takes direct reference from Julie Dash's Daughter of the Dust, but again summons this image of death, hope, resistance. So we see this image here of Beyonce leading a set of her fellow people into the water in an act of defiance that directly echoes the legend of the Flying Africans. So time and again, we see history, folklore, myth put to use, pressed into service as a way of negotiating space, as a way of imagining liberty, as a way of resisting subjugation, all through these fictional works where the boundaries between the past and the present, the everyday world and the spirit realm, are always on the verge of dissolving. This is the territory of the Black Fantastic. This is what, for me, underscores much of the work that I could see artists, in a way, gesturing to, referring to. Visual artists, also artists, as I was saying earlier, across pop culture. So we might look at, for instance, a film called Afronauts by Notoma Bodomo in 2004. We might look at back to the 70s and 1980s. You might look at the work of Abdul Mati Klarvine, whose work we see here on the left, who's a graphic designer who created album sleeves for Miles Davis and Santana, amongst others, and insisted on these wild fusions of the mystic and the mythic and the erotic outside the everyday. Might look at the work of the LA-based artist, contemporary artist Lauren Halsey. You might look at a Black Panther movie. Time and again, we see these invocations of possibility and speculation, dreaming and myth. I suppose my question really is, well, why? Why now for the Black Fantastic? After all, the long history of bigotry and violence suffered by Black people in the West potentially makes for an unlikely context for art that looks to myth and to fable, all the more so in the era of George Floyd, Black Lives Matter. But I'd argue that this turn to the fantastical that I've been describing has nothing to do with escapism. On the contrary, it suggests this refusal to live within the constraints of a society that defines Black people as inferior and alien. So I want to talk through just a couple of examples now of works from in the Black Fantastic exhibition. So think about the work of Nick Cave for a moment. Chicago-based artist Nick Cave. Nick Cave showed, and in fact, made a number of his signature artworks for the exhibition, these sound suits that he creates. The sound suits are kind of fascinating objects, really. But Nick Cave first started making these sound suits, which can occur in different forms. Each one of them is different. Sometimes these are works that are made with sequins and aspects of material. Sometimes they're made with beaded necklaces, embroidered flowers, stuffed animals, vintage toys, ceramic figurines, all sorts of different methods that he applies to the same basic material. But Nick Cave first started making sound suits in the early 90s. In fact, after seeing footage of Rodney King being savagely beaten by 4 LAPD officers in 1992. The Rodney King case was an infamous case. 4 LA police officers beat almost to death a 25-year-old man they stopped for speeding on the highway in LA. They go to court, they're charged with his assault. But during the trial, the police officers insist that they were, in fact, the figures who feared most for their lives, that Rodney King was some sort of savage animal. They talked about Rodney King as being bear-like. They said he had superhuman strength. He was like a wounded animal. He was Hulk-like. He was like a mean dog. He was a monster, they said. They insisted they were fighting for their lives against Rodney King. And they were acquitted, or they were found not guilty of his assault. Nick Cave was so disgusted and upset by the case and the verdict of that court that he began making his first sound suit. And since then, he's made over 500 of them. So the sound suits, you can wear them. They're part sculpture, part costume, part armor. And I'd suggest what they do fundamentally is they defy epidermal categorization. You put on a sound suit, you put on its elaborate colors and decorated surfaces and bright colors, but from there, it's impossible to determine one's race, one's gender. The suit transforms the body. It alters height, it alters proportion. Every suit you can wear. They're called sound suits because they make an intriguing, intoxicating sound when you move. They kind of tinkle and jangle. And they resist a singular definition of the self. They resist a racialized gaze. But crucially, this, I think in Nick Cave's case, did not imply a retreat from race. Rather, here we see resistance to Western binaries of blackness as brute and savage, as occurred with Rodney King. We see instead an insistence upon being seen in one's full spectacularity, with the fullness, with the embrace of color and life and beauty that's surely the birthright of all of us. Let's take Hugh Locke's artwork, The Ambassadors, So for the exhibition, Hugh Locke created these 4, amongst other works, photographic works, but also these sculptures. He created 4 sculptures. We can see 2 of them here. 4 sculptures of figures on horseback. In this case, one figure dressed entirely in black, carrying a flag. We look closer at the figures and we can see that across their entire surface, from the horse to their costumes, to their headgear, you see all these different symbols and ornaments. We look closer at those, and some of those, they might be colonial medals, they might be Benin bronzes, they might be a portrait of Toussaint Louverture. Hugh Locke doesn't necessarily say who the ambassadors are, but you might think of them as lords, bandits even. Hugh Locke grew up in Guyana, and you might think of these figures as having been loosed upon the world from the spirit of misrule that governs Caribbean carnival. But these figures also become a way of exploring how the black figure has been historically represented in art. So we look closer at these figures and we can see that Hugh Locke is drawing together art historical references, as I said, from Benin bronzes, portraits of Toussaint Louverture. But if we look just at the base, you might be able to see at the base dangling from the horse's head, we can see 2 figures dangling, and we see a resemblance really between these figures dangling from the neck of the horse and a William Blake etching, a Negro hung alive by the ribs to a gallows from 1796. Here, Hugh Locke is reclaiming art history. He is asserting the subjective, centralized experience of a black figure here, not per se as a victim, not per se as simply the object of analysis and white violence that we see in William Blake's etching, but as a symbol of past horror and present day speculative resistance, speculative thriving. And I suppose this comes down to the central fundamental closing point I want to make about what I saw and felt as a tendency that I wanted to explore in the exhibition in the Black Fantastic. Work of Nick Cave, Hugh Locke, also the other artists in the show, Kara Walker, Wangechi Mutu. All of these, to me, all of their work to me speaks of a way of navigating in the world based on what the poet Elizabeth Alexander has called a metaphysical space beyond the black public everyday. Elizabeth Alexander talked about a space governed by the power and wild imagination that black people ourselves know we possess. This is what I thought of while I was putting together the exhibition. Ultimately, it's my suggestion that when we look at these works, I suggest we might best understand the Black Fantastic not as a movement or a rigid category of some sort, but something closer to a way of seeing, a way of being, a way of walking in the world, a way of conjuring worlds that makes sense of the fraught experience of the racialized everyday by embracing fantasy as a zone of creative and cultural liberation. When I made the exhibition, I called it In the Black Fantastic. In suggests the Black Fantastic as an active, not a passive condition, a space to explore, a terrain to occupy. This was the intention of the show as a physical experience. I wanted to be within the Black Fantastic. I wanted to invite a sharing of a view, of a perspective, of a way of seeing. You might then speak in conclusion of that experience. I hope the experience of the exhibition as a site and as a zone of Black dreaming, Black possibility, a site that implies a reaching beyond, that invokes a state of being, a way of seeing. This to me is the Black Fantastic. Thank you. I can come out of.
Yeah, I'm figuring out how to get out of it. Thank you so much, Echo. This was an enlightening and a very sobering presentation as well, about an exhibition which was a great highlight. I wanted to quickly get in before anybody else and ask you, how exactly did it come about? Did you plan the exhibition and the Hayward Gallery said okay, or was the Hayward Gallery looking for
No, I just proposed it to Ralph Rugoff, the director of the Hayward, and we just sat down and talked it through. So I pretty much had the show in mind, but the great thing with working with Ralph and working with the Hayward is that, I mean, with any space really, once you're in a space, then a show takes a form that relates to that space. So in a way, the show became, we did this very much thinking about the space of the Hayward and thinking about how to exploit the possibilities of that space. It's a tricky space in some respects. So we were trying to think about, okay, well, if this is the proposition, if these are the artists, then what can we do in here? And so we worked pretty collaboratively, but the idea and the proposition in the first place was mine.
And so how do you see your role then? Because you mentioned resisting Western binaries, and then or skeptical of Western binaries, but also you were talking about enlightening, you were talking about ways of seeing and showing people ways of seeing. Is it also as a guide? How do you see yourself in this mix?
Oh, I mean, I guess, look, you know, I think the privilege of being a curator is that you get to sit and think and work with artists. I mean, for the evolution of the exhibition, I came up with a concept, talking with the Hayward about it. But once we agreed to move ahead with it, then that involved a conversation with all the artists in the show and talking to them about what the proposition was, about how they saw that, and so on. The privilege of the curator is you get to craft this project. If you're doing a group show, there also comes a responsibility to, I think, hopefully show the work of those artists to the best means that you're able to, within the context of the proposition of that exhibition. So I take that responsibility quite seriously. So to that extent, my role is partly to do with being a temporary custodian of their work and their aesthetics and their ideas as artists, and then trying to create a context within which hopefully we shed some potentially new light on how we might see those artists. So the point about a group show is that it offers a way of looking at those artists. So the part I bring to it is to say, look, Chris Ofili, Wangechi Karaborka, these are already extraordinary artists. But what happens if we put them together in this particular framework, and that particular framework allows us then perhaps to see an aspect of their work which we hadn't necessarily thought about or seen in these terms. So that's my role. My role is a position of perspective. It offers a point of view that hasn't necessarily been seen before, at least when it comes to gathering those artists together. That's what I do.
I know that a lot of art historians and curators watching this will find that very, very informative. We've got some questions here. The first one, thanks you very much for your presentation, and asking if you could please comment a little bit more about the SF aesthetics in some of the works and the inspiration behind it.
Yeah, well, I mean, again, obviously, you know, the aesthetics are the works of the artists. So what happened? So I mean, you know, we worked on the show for about, for about 3 years, but most of that time is during lockdown. So you're working remotely, you're working on screens, and it meant that it was really only in the final stages of installation when we got to see what the works looked like really together. Be mapping everything out and different models and plans, but up until then, even I wasn't necessarily aware of some of the connections aesthetically that started to become apparent once you start to marry the work together. So one of the joyous parts of the show was seeing the ways that so many artists in the exhibition using aspects of collage, using really rich decoration and patterning, guess thinking simultaneously through different art forms, moving image, sound, sometimes painting, sometimes photography, aspects of sculpture. So you did see continuities emerge across the course of the show, which, given that the Hayward itself is an interesting space, you know, sits on different levels, different layers, there's no single necessary path through the show or through the space. For me, it was exciting, in fact, to see revealed these different patterns. So the aesthetic continuities in the show, I think, came out of a similar grounding that the artist had in wanting to explore some aspects of tarot. For instance, I talked in this presentation about these relationships around time, about the kind of persistence of these historical narratives or fables or myths. Actually, undergirding so much of that is how these different artists are actually still grappling, in effect, with the aftermath of slavery, with the aftermath of 400 years of exploitation and subjugation. So, to be honest, if there's a single thing that marries the work, and yeah, we can see aspects of pattern and collage that come into play, but for me, actually, the real thing is that collectively, the artists they're exploring propositions of morality. They're exploring propositions, in fact, to do with life and death. And it gives the works, I mean, those are kind of big topics, but it gives the work a kind of moral urgency. But it also, being artists like the ones, you know, Hugh Locke and so on, being successful artists, they're also able to do at least more than two things at the same time, which is to grapple with these grave propositions of life, the denial of life, and so on. But also reach towards beauty, also reach towards color, also reach towards pattern, also reach towards life. And the goal overall was to create an experience that is visually beguiling, is compelling, is enjoyable, simultaneously with addressing grave topics of death, of hundreds of years of pain and of suffering. Turns out accomplished artists are capable of holding more than one set of propositions at the same time. And all we were trying to do was bring alive those tensions and the possibilities that come out from there. And yes, you start to see those linkages.
Yes, thank you. I'll get on to another question that I've got here. Again, thanking you very much for an amazing, amazing exhibition, an amazing show. I think they're asking whether you think Afrofuturity, which is implicit in the Black Fantastic, has an aspect which is less about resistance to racialization, and but as more a rising of new conception of humanity.
Ooh,
I think perhaps you've touched on that a little bit, but could you say a little more?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I don't necessarily make a distinction that way, in that if you are offering speculative propositions of futurity, we talk about those, we might talk about those in terms of Black Fantastic or Afrofuturism, but also these are fundamentally propositions for living, irrespective of color. Again, part of this is about trying to see beyond some of these binaries around racial condition or racial construction. Part of the liberation, or my proposition here, is that aspects of liberation can come from going within that, from thinking about Blackness, but not Blackness to the exclusion, in fact, of another condition, but simply to say that Blackness in itself can be a place of fantastic richness and fantastic possibility, rather than a place of constraint. Thomas Jefferson, in the 18th century, Thomas Jefferson, one of the founding fathers of America, he wrote an essay on beauty where he made a distinction between beauty as a condition of whiteness, as an epidermal condition of whiteness, and beauty as it related to Black skin color. Thomas Jefferson talked about how Blackness was innately ugly, innately crude, how Black people themselves were kind of incapable of reasoning, impossible to retain memory and so on. But even in terms of skin color, he said there was a fundamental difference between white skin, which was kind of spectacular and capable of catching light and so on, Black skin, which was dull and ugly and so on. So look, so when I talk about Blackness as richness, it's really in opposition to the idea that Blackness is a negation of possibility. That's not then to the exclusion of anything other than that, simply to say that an assertion of aliveness hopefully offers space for all of us then yet to dream further about who any of us might be. Just trying to expand the territory to move beyond the disinclusion of some, to move beyond the binary that says there's only one way to think about a possible future, and that lies through Western rationality. So Afrofuturism or these speculative notions of being, for me, aren't about saying, well, let's just think about Blackness and or humanity. This is about saying this is one route to thinking about how humanity itself can be beautiful and various and alive and glorious and diverse and so on.
Thank you very much. Another, I think we've only got time for another question, and so to perhaps combine a couple here. The idea of, do you see the idea of speculation as a method of resisting? And what opportunities do speculative design and speculative fiction open for challenging the status quo?
Ooh, well, I mean, let me take the second one as a route, I think, to both of those. So yeah, I mean, look, I place a great faith in the speculative, in the imaginative. I mean, in a way, how could we not? Look, this is a gathering of art historians. What are we doing here? You know, but placing some faith in the idea that art can allow us to see. What do artists do in the first place anyway, which is they construct their own worlds. Sometimes that looks like reality, but it's always a conceptual exercise. It's always nothing but an. What else do you call something of making something from nothing? That's what artists, artworks of all kinds do. When it comes to the territory I'm interested in, the imaginary space of the Black Fantastic turns out not to be a neutral space in the first place, because it's already populated with these ideas of what Blackness is and who Black people are. So the act of imagining, the act of dreaming, the act of speculation becomes all the more urgent as a way to counter that, resist that. But then simply, I would say, the goal is to, it's not per se to resist, it's simply to say we are. It's simply to say we live. It's simply to say we are alive and we thrive. That, however, has to be, ends up becoming a speculative act, because these very simple propositions of being alive, like the term Black Lives Matter, apparently in some circles becomes contentious. So to simply say being Black and alive is a condition that deserves to be honored, that deserves to be recognized, involves then an act of imagining, an act of speculating, where we move through negation towards possibility. Overall, it's a useful exercise. I tend to think that can be applied in many other circumstances. So yes, I place a great faith in being able to think aloud towards aliveness, in being able to imagine who we are, how we might live beyond what we see and what we might move towards.
Well, thank you very, very much for that that enlightening talk. I know that Tom and Christina and I were very grateful for your taking the time to do that, and I'm sure everybody's clapping in their own muted way. Thank you very much, Echo.
Thank you very much, Sophie. Thank you.
It's my pleasure. Now I am moving on to the first session, and we're going to start with an artist showcase, which is a new format that we have come upon in order to be more inclusive and to invite creative artists to present their work. The first is Alicia Ray. She's a third generation Nikkei Australian, or Japanese Australian. She's an artist researching for a PhD at the University of Technology in Australia, and her art practice investigates transcultural identity that is imbued with ambivalence of pride in Japanese cultural heritage, intergenerational remnants of pain from racial discrimination. And her showcase, the showcase that she's going to be presenting to us today, is entitled Transcultural Identity. Alicia, I leave it to you.
Thank you so much, Sophie, and thank you, everybody. I'll just take a moment to share my screen first. Okay. All right, sorry, just take one moment. There we go. All right, it's just processing now. So yes, as Sophie said, I'm a Nikkei Australian artist, and just to explain that the word Nikkei means, it's a Japanese word for descendant, and it's like a collective identity used for diaspora of people with Japanese ancestry across the world. And so it's a collective identity term. And I'm based in Brisbane in Australia. So good evening to all of you from sunny Queensland. So my arts practice and my research is currently investigating this transcultural identity, and I'm doing so by archiving Nikkei histories in contemporary paper cutting arts practice. But first, I better explain exactly what paper cutting is for those of you who may not have heard of this medium before. So the art of paper cutting is about essentially drawing with a knife, is how I explain it, creating visual narratives by cutting out spaces from a substrate. And in this case, I'm using paper, and I'm cutting with a scalpel, as you can see on the right-hand side there. So I always create my works from one single sheet of paper, which then challenges the structural integrity of the design that I'm trying to cut out. So on the left is a photo of my Australian grandfather with my Japanese grandmother. She was one of 650 war brides who immigrated to Australia after World War II. They met in Japan during the British Commonwealth occupation forces. So she had a very interesting life, adjusting into Australian ways of being. The work on the right-hand side there is called Rabbit Proof Fence, and it really marks the beginning of this creative investigation research. And the work really began the moment that I discovered my grandmother's immigration file in the National Archives of Australia. And her arrival in 1953 was not long after the former immigration minister in Australia, Arthur Caldwell. He said in 1948 publicly that no Japanese women or any half-castes either will be admitted to Australia. They're simply not wanted and are permanently undesirable. So when thinking about the label permanently undesirable, rabbits came to mind. In my state of Queensland in Australia, they're still outlawed as a pest, and They were creatures that were first introduced with the first fleet of convicts from England in 1788, and they became a huge problem in the 1880s as growing populations damaged crops and it led to soil erosion. So they constructed what they called a rabbit-proof fence from the south to the north of the Australian continent, and this began construction in 1901. It just so happens to be the same year that the Immigration Restriction Act 1901 came into effect, and it's colloquially known as the White Australia Policy. And what it effectively did was stopped all non-European immigration into the country, and it wasn't even completely dismantled until 1973, so still within living memory. So this work, Rabbit-Proof Fence, is all hand cut in one sheet of paper, and it is a replica of the same wiring used in the construction of the actual rabbit-proof fence. And it's used as a representation of that attempt to keep out rabbits as an allegory for the political and the social barriers that my Japanese grandmother faced with her arrival in Australia. And just so happens to be that in lunar horoscopes, 2023 is also Year of the Rabbit, which my grandmother was. She would have been 96 this year. So the work in and of itself is an ironic interpretation of this Immigration Restriction Act, which essentially was a fence made of paper. The story of my grandparents' relationship, who found love in the aftermath of war, inspired this next installation and honors that gesture of peace and diplomacy between two former enemies of Japan and Australia. Looking at some works in details here, we've got a ground plane work featuring the koi fish, which actually is another allegorical connection to another invasive species here, the koi carp. And it's a strong metaphor for my Japanese heritage because it's got that ambivalence of that displacement, but it's also a very strong visual cue for Japanese culture as well. Also part of the installation are a series of these hand-cut bonsai trees, and these are created from reference photos that I took in the Brisbane Botanic Gardens locally. Each tree is also cut from a single piece of paper, but as you can see, it hangs upside down, never completely letting go of its origin. The materiality of the work connects to my grandmother's experiences of assimilating into Australian culture, to the point where my mother missed out on a lot of inheritance of language and cultural heritage. However, despite this, my grandmother never completely let go of her connection to Japan, much like the bonsai refuses to let go of the paper that it was cut out of. Below each installation of the bonsai is a pile of the cutout paper that's taken from the leaves. And this is like the first time I started to actually collect these paper remnants and keep it as part of the work. I like to think that it creates a symbol of like cultural remnants that were lost intergenerationally. And with the collection of these paper remnants, the bonsai tree and the piece of paper that it was cut out of, it references these three spaces, kind of like that third space of identity that Homi Bhabha has referenced in his work, that space in between two cultures. My Nikkei experience was contextualized in a global sense. Earlier this year, I was an artist in residence in Canada, which has a huge Japanese-Canadian community. And the Choices research project. And this project is focusing on illuminating histories from across all allied countries, including Australia, Canada, the US, and Brazil, who all have Japanese diaspora communities that were interned or incarcerated during World War II. So during this residency, I found myself drawn to oral histories and historical images referencing invasive plant species, and they provided a really strong allegorical connection to these internment and incarceration histories. So I started to create studies in hand-cut paper. This species here, its scientific name is Petacites japonica, otherwise known as colt's foot or Japanese butterbur, or in Japanese, it's called fuki. It was introduced to Canada in the 1920s by the Japanese-Canadian community, and it was common in gardens by the 1930s. So it's a native plant to Japan. The flowers come up first in early spring, and then the leaves appear in the summertime. This is an image of the leaves there. So it became a strong point of investigation, and I discovered that lots of these plants were eaten and grown on the West Coast during early Canadian immigration, and then they were physically uprooted and transplanted and taken with communities to internment camps in the interior of Canada, which then sort of helped to map the journey of these communities who had cultivated them. So they were planted for food. The stems of the leaves could be stir-fried, and the flowers could be pickled or deep-fried. This is another image of the plant with its rhizome. So in Canada, the plants are still classed as an invasive species, and I thought it was quite interesting that they shared this very racialized history along with the Japanese Canadian community that planted them. And there's even some of the language historically in the records that I came across that uses quite derogatory references to Japanese Canadians and Japanese American communities, citing things like being very invasive and biologically inferior, but talking about people, not just the plants. This next study was sparked by oral histories and photographic references to barbed wire used in internment camps in the US and Australia. So I recreated it in hand-cut washi paper, and then just realized through that process that the materiality of that paper really exemplified this ambivalence that I kept coming across in my research, these instances of strength alongside fragility. Because when you think about barbed wire, it's something that you really don't want to touch. It repels you. But suddenly when it was transformed into this really soft, fragile paper medium, it turned into this really tactile, gentle kind of object. This is a resolved work that pulled all of those studies together. So you've got the plant, the fuki leaf, and the flower in the middle, and then the barbed wire elements around the outside. And it's created into this stylized black and white paper cut that references a kamon, which is a Japanese word for a family crest. And so it became quite a traditional symbol of identity then, referencing cultural heritage. On a first glance, you may not realize that this image is referencing an archival photo, and it was taken in an Australian internment camp. So it's a hand-cut black paper washi study with a white background behind it. And I wanted to create it to accentuate this ornate Japanese garden, which was built by Japanese internees, civilian internees in Australia. So this is the original reference image. It's from the Australian War Memorial, and the item description is a landscaped type Japanese garden built by internees in 14B compound of number 14 camp in the Loveday internment camp group. So you'll see here more clearly in the original image the full context of this photo. And the way that these images were created opened up a new process of making for me. So I ended up taking a new direction by actually cutting into facsimiles of archival copies of these photographs in order to understand them and study them through the act of recreating them in cut paper. So by comparing the two images, you'll see that I've eliminated some of the background detail and simplified some of the rocks and the plants. So I really wanted to exemplify the bridge structure, which has been beautifully crafted, and creating that very ornate Japanese garden aesthetic in order to invite the viewers in and then reveal the context of the history within the work by either reading the title of it or an artist's statement. The second work in this study features a charnel house, which is the beautiful structure in the center there. Those were created by Japanese internees in the camps to commemorate those who passed away in the camps. So they would put items of their hair or their fingernails inside as an offering. So cutting this work also revealed some interesting details that I overlooked when I first was observing the photographic original record. So putting them side by side, you can see on the right-hand side, there's a lamppost that's standing by itself in the paper cut there. When I was cutting that out, I did the top of the lamppost first, and then I was wanting to try and find where the pole was underneath it, was holding it up. I was expecting to find a straight pole, and as you can see, all the foliage in the background made it quite difficult to see where it was. So only was upon forcing myself to cut this image that I discovered that it wasn't actually a straight pole at all. It was actually a tree branch. So it revealed all these hidden details within the photograph. Another piece of the photograph, which was really unclear at first, on the bottom right-hand side, there's little details sticking out from the right-hand side of the photo there. And that wasn't clear what it was until I realized that cutting it out was actually a water tap sticking out on the side of the photo. And that then connected to a hose pipe that was used as a bit of a design feature as it sprawled across the pathway in front of the structure there. And the final work in this series, I decided to keep the detail of the barbed wire in the background there, many hours of cutting that out. It definitely changed the context. It made it more obvious that it wasn't just an ornate Japanese garden. It made it more obvious that it was something that was a little bit more sinister, maybe within the image. So through the very process of cutting it out of such a fragile material, it was also quite empowering to then think really carefully, almost like a process of archival appraisal, deciding what parts of the paper to keep and what parts to cut out in order to create an image that held together. It's all joined as one piece of paper, but still it tried to tell the narrative within the story as well. So literally, there's a fine paper line between keeping the image intact whilst honoring and representing the detail within the original record. So side by side, you can see them there. So these photos of ornate Japanese gardens constructed by camp internees are now created in paper. They project an ambivalence of beauty and resilience in transforming the landscape with such an aesthetic commitment by these people that were interned. But at the same time, they reflect upon the environment of racial persecution that they were situated within. So paper cutting and archival record of these gardens could be argued as a form of like a research methodology because it forced an active agency of seeing through making. So my creative practice utilizes archival records and the allegory of invasive species to interpret and archive an inherent ambivalence, beauty alongside brutality, the harsh histories embedded within the fragility of paper, and the sense of belonging found in the collective unbelonging in that third space between two cultures. So I argue that contemporary artists, well, particularly the practice that I'm trying to develop, has a role in making difficult histories and those that are lesser known more accessible to a wider audience. So by inviting the viewer in through the craftsmanship of my hand-cut paperwork, I hope to then reveal narratives of the spaces in between these histories and hope to conjure more of an emotional response that creates space for acknowledgement and understanding. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Alicia. I'm very grateful. This was such a personal and thoughtful and powerful presentation of your work, which is beautiful. We've had some questions, but I'm afraid we don't have any time. But just quickly, Can you let us know where we can see? So have you got a website or?
Yes. So you can see my name in the little corner of the Zoom box there. It's aliciaray.com, and I've got pages from the residency works up there and the Rabbit Proof Fence with artist statements as well. Yes.
Brilliant. Okay, so everyone's heard that for potentially for exhibitions and references, and also to contact Alicia, do go ahead. Thank you very much indeed. On to our next paper then. Joo-hee Kim is a Korean contemporary art researcher and curator. She's got a BA in art history and political science from Seoul National University and is currently studying for an MA in art management. She's got an interesting fine art. She's interested in fine arts engagement with popular culture and photography, I should say. And her thesis is on a Korean art collective, Reality and Utterance, whose works actively adopted contemporary mass cultural images in the early 1980s. So she's going to present her paper, Towards Realism, Beyond Realism, Reality and Utterance's Resistance Against Modernism. I leave it to you. Thank you.
Thank you for the introduction, Susie. Let me share the screen first. Sorry. Is it working, Sophie? Okay.
Yes, it is.
Okay, thank you. Hi, I'm Joo-hee Kim, and as Sophie kindly mentioned, I'm based in Seoul, and I'm studying Korean modern history at Seoul National University. Today, I'm going to present the Korean art collective Reality and Utterance under the title Toward Realism, Beyond Realism, Reality and Utterance's Resistance Against Modernism. In December 1979, a dozen artists in Seoul formed an art collective called Reality and Utterance. The group started as an antithesis of Dansekwa, an abstract art movement that dominated the Korean art scene in the 1970s. Criticizing Dansekwa that it has alienated and isolated the true reality of its neighborhood, the group called for new art practices that actively engage with contemporary social reality. The group was particularly drawn to the rapid industrialization, urbanization, and massive popular culture that Korean society faced around the 1980s. In Korean art history discourse, Reality and Utterance has held a noticeable position as the beginning of Minjung art, the politically charged art movement that fought against dictatorship and capitalism on the side of workers and peasants through the 1980s. Dansekwa and Minjung art shaped the two mainstream Korean art movements in the 20th century. In the context of Minjung art discourse, the works of Reality and Utterance have been interpreted as social criticism, like other Minjung art practices. However, I want to argue that the group's practices were more than just social criticism, and that the group sought more complicated and sophisticated ways to integrate art and society. We can say that Reality and Utterance's practices have been discussed only as political and social resistance, and its aesthetic resistance against Dansekwa was neglected, as an aesthetic relationship between Dansekwa and Minjung art has often been simplified as the position between figuration and abstraction. I argue that Reality and Utterance, while pursuing social realist aesthetics of Minjung art, went beyond it at the same time by observing the legacies of the historical avant-garde. First, we will look into Kim Jung-hun's Creating an Affluent Life. In this work, the artist juxtaposed the interior of an urban middle-class apartment and a farmer's back planting rice. The background of this work is known as the representation of the advertising image of Lucky Monoleum, the most popular flooring brand of the time. This work has been interpreted as criticism against the rapid urbanization and resulting economic polarization between city and the countryside, or a contrast between the false happiness the advertisement promotes and the painful truth of life. However, considering the changes in the residential environment of the middle class in Seoul around 1980, and the fact that Kim himself was a part of the changes, the message of this work cannot be reduced to simple criticism against urbanization, economic polarization, and advertising. I'm sure you all heard of Gangnam from Gangnam Style. Gangnam means south of the Han River, so sometimes it refers to the entire southern area of Seoul, but usually it refers to a specific district marked in red on the screen. This district is the richest, the most developed area in Seoul today. However, it was only in the late 1970s that Gangnam began to develop. Until then, Gangnam was nothing but rice paddies and fields. It was always Gangbuk, north of the Han River, that was Seoul's political and economic center. The Korean government began to develop Gangnam in earnest in the late 1970s because Gangbuk could no longer handle the population flooding into Seoul. So large-scale apartment complexes were built in Gangnam and emerged as new residences for the middle class in Seoul. Kim, the artist, was also a middle-class citizen of Seoul who moved from Gangbuk to Gangnam during this period. Let us go back to his work with this context in mind. By copying the advertising image of the most popular apartment flooring brand of the time, the artist depicted in detail the electronic devices, furniture, and a vinyl flooring model that were indeed loved by the middle class at the time. This practice was an interested response to his own constantly changing surroundings. In this work, Kim captured the changes in middle-class lifestyles and the urban environment of Seoul with intrigued eyes. In addition, by depicting a popular advertisement of the time, this work undermined the hierarchy between high art and popular culture and provided familiarity, readability, and fun to its contemporary viewers. Next, let us take a look at Park Bul-dong's photomontage works. These works were produced in the mid-1980s, when the Minjung art movement was fiercely active, so the political implications of the work strengthened. In Commander His Excellency's Troubles, Park created an image that looks like one giant military weapon by assembling images of the US military, missiles, and a commercialized female body. In Coca-Cola Firebomb, Coca-Cola and the American flag were combined into the shape of a firebomb that Korean citizens used against the police and military during the pro-democracy protest against the dictatorship. These two works express the artist's antipathy toward the United States military intervention in the Korean Peninsula and commercial popular culture imported from the United States. The scholars have focused on the solid social criticism these works deliver. I, however, want to focus on their medium, photomontage. All Minjung art practices, besides reality and utterance, stuck to figure painting. They demonstrated harsh hostility toward capitalism and its cultural products, which is popular culture, and valued tradition and the countryside. Reality and utterance, however, explored non-traditional art mediums such as collage and photomontage, and actively appropriated images from mass media in their works. By directly appropriating images from mass media, Park blurred the boundaries between fine art and popular culture more so than Kim Jong-hyun, who represented the advertisement on the canvas. And more importantly, these photomontages suggested changing conceptions of art and authorship in Korean art history by breaking away from the manual labor of traditional painting. In these works, the artist's role has shifted from representing reality with a brush on canvas to assembling found images. Park adopted the production process of modern society, which is to assemble fragmented parts to produce artwork. This is why Berlin Dada is the first generation of artists who internalized modern society's industrialized and mechanized conditions call themselves engineers, not artists. The artworks, too, are no longer the original representation of reality produced by artists, but a combination of fragments of reality. While addressing social reality and criticizing reality were more urgent tasks, photomontages of reality and utterance carried aesthetic avant-garde, although never been pointed out acutely. Next, we will look at another photomontage made by Song Hwan-kyung. Song was the one who proposed that the group address the issues of urbanization and urban visual culture at the time of the group's founding. While several group members pursued traditional realism and concentrated on subjects and contents of artwork, some pursued conceptual and institutional innovation, referring to the legacies of the historical avant-garde. Through several articles, lectures, and workshops, some provided a theoretical basis for reality in utterance and encouraged the members to explore new mediums, such as collage and photomontage. Working as the president of the group for several years, he played a leading role in making the artistic practices of the group take on an avant-gardist nature, unlike other Minjung art practices. This photomontage was made by combining a cosmetic advertisement from a woman's magazine and text fragments from Pulp Fiction. The woman's eyes are covered with the words cold and cruel, and the following text is inserted next to it. Why wouldn't I want to cry? Long days and nights, no matter how much I say out loud that I'm not scared, I get frightened when my hands move freely, isolated from my body. The enigmatic title and the appropriate texts that are difficult to logically understand confuse viewers trying to comprehend the meaning. This work also exudes a somewhat playful atmosphere through the combination of an image that highlights women's sexual appeal and emotionally charged text. We can assume that this work formed critical context against advertising by exaggerating the characteristics of advertising that commercialize women and appeal to emotions. However, unlike other works of the group that have a clear target of criticism and convey relatively solid messages, the meaning of this work is very vague and fluid. Some appeared more interested in reacting to contemporary visual culture, exhibiting popular culture in the name of art, and narrowing the distance between high culture and the kitsch sensibility of low culture than conveying social criticism. Indeed, he demanded that fine art actively mix its forms and interpenetrate each other with all kinds of paintings other than its own, that is, popular visual culture. Some dreamed of an expanded field of art as visual culture. In the group lecture, some suggested the concept of art as visual culture, arguing it is desirable to focus on a wide range of new visual realities, such as comics, advertisements, illustrations, architecture, photography, and film, and redefine the field of artistic expression. Under the influence of Song, Reality in Utterance selected 3 research subjects: murals, print and posters, and publishing art, and studied ways to expand their artistic practices into each field. However, the group's ambition toward art beyond the existing art system remained theoretical and showed great limitations in actual practices. Lastly, I want to emphasize that Reality in Utterance's works were one of the earliest Korean art practices that engaged with photographic materials. In addition to the photomontages we have seen so far, Song also produced works based on photographs of Seoul cityscapes that he had taken himself. Perhaps the most well-known photography work of the group is Kim Yong-tae's DMG. The artist made this work by collecting photos left behind in the photo studios around US military bases in Korea. These private photographs provide a glimpse into eventful Korean history in the 20th century. The artist did not intend to convey his own critical opinion in this work. It is up to the viewers how to perceive these images and their background history. As we have seen so far, the practices of Reality in Utterance embodied more complicated context than mere social criticism. Actively engaging with the modern changes in Korea and contemporary visual culture, the group demonstrated an avant-gardist concept of art and authorship, unlike other Minjung art practices. Okay, this is the end of my presentation. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much. This was a really powerful presentation, and I've learned so much I'm very grateful. We have some questions here, but I wanted to ask you, and I know we don't have very much time, I wanted to ask you if you could say a little bit more about the kind of materiality of these art forms and the choice to reuse advertising and existing media as a form of reaction of resistance, rather than perhaps more traditional forms of creative media.
Okay. Okay, so they actively appropriate images from mass media and advertising, and many scholars have focused on their critical attitude toward advertising, but only one scholar have pointed out that their attitude was not all critical but ambivalent, because they still showed a deep curiosity, and popular culture is very fun and charming and exciting. So they were still excited about the modern changes in Korea and how these changes were changing their visual realities around them. So they were drawn to popular culture and they actively appropriated them in their works. And I want to focus more on the aesthetic meaning of that practice, because the existing publications have all still focused on the contents and their attitude and subjects. But I thought that they could explore new mediums such as collage and photomontage, because they decided to appropriate images directly from mass media. And I thought that there was a significant difference between Minjung art and this group, because most Minjung artists were focused only on the figurative painting. So I think that's the point, yes.
Thank you very much. Looking here, we have another question regarding the 1980s. So you didn't say much about what came afterwards, and a little bit about what came before in terms of resistance, but could you tell us a little bit more about that?
You mean like
these
in the mid
groups? I think what they mean is these particular groups, did they continue to be active, or is there another story?
Okay, so they were founded in 1979 and they were very active in the early 1980s. But the group was more about the socio-economical changes in Korea. And actually they lost their momentum in the mid 1980s, even though I introduced some works from that period. Because in the mid 1980s, Minjung art was all about like politics, peasants, workers, very leftist political ideological art movement. So Reality in Appearance was like not at the center of this movement at this period. And they still did not disband, and they still exhibited group exhibitions until the late 1980s, but no more of group work after that.
Well, thank you very, very much for this talk. As I said, I learned very much. I learned a lot, and I'm sure that many others did as well. Moving on then to our second paper, I'd like to oh, the recording started again. You'll have to tell me how to pronounce your name correctly. She's currently a master's student in art history at the University of St Andrews. She completed her undergraduate studies at the University of Glasgow. So a true Scot. She's inspired by cross-cultural art in the 19th century, particularly the image of Japan in British visual culture. Her paper is entitled James McNeill Whistler's Paintings Featuring Japanese Objects and the Culture of Japanism in Relation to Britain's Cultural Politics Towards Japan. I leave it to you.
Hi, thank you for introducing me, Sophie. Hi, and hello everyone, I'm Jin. Yeah, my presentation is actually a part of my recently submitted dissertation to the University of St Andrews, so I'm really excited to be sharing it here today. So the subject, okay, full screen here. The subject of my presentation is aestheticizing Japanese objects, politicizing Japonisme It discusses the American artist James McNeill Whistler's representation of Japanese objects in the early 1860s in relation to the culture of Japonisme in Britain. So just to explain the key terminology, Japonisme, it is a term often used to refer to the European and American craze for anything Japanese following the end of Japan's isolationist policy in 1858. So as Whistler's painting The Golden Screen, which you can see on this slide, illustrates, Japonisme manifested in avant-garde artists' fascination with Japanese woodblock prints or ukiyo-e prints, particularly with their pictorial principles, and also the mass consumption of Japanese goods on a wider social scale. As a cultural phenomenon, Japonisme is now very well known as an integral part of European modern art movements and consumer culture. But today I want to reconsider Whistler's use of Japanese objects for inventing modern art and offer a narrative of resistance by grounding Whistler's artistic production in the material context of the cross-cultural exchanges between Japan and Britain in the 1860s. So my presentation will first address the methodology for studying artistic Japonisme, and then point out some of the problematics of Whistler's engagement with Japonisme in his paintings. And to put forward a revisionist account of Japonisme, I think it's essential for me to first clarify the background research. So the term was first coined in 1872 and it was used interchangeably with a related term, japonisserie, to denote the study of the art and genius of Japan in Western societies by contemporary critics, artists, and collectors. However, in the historiography of Japonism since the 1970s, the two terms have often been positioned in a hierarchical relationship. It has been argued, and I quote, that Japonisserie exists as a necessary antecedent of Japonisme, leading up to the latter and in due course giving place to it, unquote. So, of course, this misleading distinction has not gone completely unchallenged during the last 5 decades, but a bias that remains entrenched to this day is that Japonisserie often evokes association with superficial imitation of the exotic effect of Japanese art by showing white models wearing Japanese garments in a space surrounded by a profusion of Japanese paraphernalia. Whistler's The Princess from the Land of Porcelain, which you see on the left of this slide, is an often cited example for that category. On the other hand, the term Japonisme usually marks the truly profound and mature assimilation of Japanese aesthetic principles into Western art, as epitomized by Whistler's Nocturnes, which were made in the 1870s, so a decade later. So this comparison is one of the many examples in existing studies which tend to privilege the stylistic and technical aspect of artistic Japonisme, while neglecting to explain the subject matters of Japanese objects in those paintings. And in the case of a quintessential Japonisserie like The Princess, a deceptively straightforward question could arise. What did Whistler achieve by depicting Japanese objects in that particular context in 1863? So in that year, Whistler had already reoriented his focus in art from art's realism to its decorative quality. As a result, his main concern in The Princess was the harmonious integration of all pictorial elements into a decorative pattern. If we look closely at this painting surface, we can see that the artist used really fluid brushstrokes to evenly paint all pictorial elements. So instead of emphasizing the facial features of the model, Christina Spartali, in a way that defied the convention of Victorian portraiture. So in the end, Spartali's softened skin tone matches the flesh-colored kimono, while her red lips echo the scarlet sash around her waist and also the embroideries. So like the immobile objects around her, Spartali loses her individual corporeality in this painting and becomes transformed into a component of a harmoniously composed decorative scheme. The relevance of Japanese objects to Whistler's experiment with aestheticism, I've explained so far, has been often acknowledged. So what I'm trying to emphasize is the link between the visual effect of the princess and the specific signification of its content. So in 1863, when Whistler started to paint this picture, trades with Japan only began 5 years ago in 1858, and Japanese objects, although imported in large quantity into Western societies, they simply had not penetrated the lives of the Victorian public. In fact, as late as 1866, a review of the princess still referred to the kimono, the Japanese garment, as a long, loose robe with a broad scarf, and the porcelain vase in the back as a rug of bluish white, making no reference to their Oriental origin. As culturally unfamiliar curiosities, Japanese objects resisted a hermeneutic approach in line with Victorian symbolism, which Whistler explicitly rejected when exhibiting his first Symphony in White, which you see on the right. Whereas the white girl's modern dress and Victorian interior inevitably invited conventional criticism, the princess is replete with Oriental novelties, which did not have any codified values, at least in that context, and therefore presented an ambivalent image that draws full attention to the painting's formal beauty. So what that comparison shows is that Japanese objects were not only incorporated into Whistler's paintings as subject matters that reflect a fad in the late 19th century. Whistler's entire project, his entire experiment with aestheticism in the early 1860s, in fact, capitalized on the semantic availability of these objects when they were first introduced to Britain. So in other words, the art historical significance the princess later achieved as an aesthetic tour de force partly depended on the cultural alterity it signified in the Victorian art market to contemporary audience. So therefore, I argue for a methodology that decentralizes authorial intent and recognizes pictorial motifs as a material science that are embedded in and acquire meanings from a broader social and cultural framework. It is by attending to the multiplicity of meanings that science can project that this presentation will differ from established knowledge about Whistler's Japonisme, which usually considers its role in European modernism at the expense of what is beyond the artistic realm. While Japanese objects suggested aesthetic possibilities to a modern artist like Whistler, they also pointed an inseparable link between artistic Japonisme and British imperialism when placed in the context of a global network of cross-cultural encounters, which I will move on to next. So at this point, an under-acknowledged fact that must be brought to the foreground is that the opening of Japan to world trade depended on the military disparity between feudal Japan and industrialized modern Western states. So in 1858, when Japan signed the treaties to trade with foreign powers, the country had not only been directly threatened by Commodore Matthew Perry's display of the overwhelming military advantage of the American fleet in 1853, but had also been alerted by China's recent defeat in the Opium Wars. The Japanese government's renewed perception of the military and technological supremacy of the West prompted their signing of treaties to defend their own sovereignty, especially at a time of internal chaos in Japan. The subsequent commercial relations too, although developed to the advantage of Japan's much needed modernization, were fundamentally underpinned by unequal power relations. Sir Rutherford Alcock, the first British minister in Japan, he was one of those responsible for the bombardment of Shimonoseki, the Shimonoseki Straits, when Britain's treaty rights to trade were threatened by local uprisings against the presence of foreigners and those very treaties. In light of the military intervention and political tension that underlaid economic transactions, which then paved the way for cultural exchanges that resulted in the phenomenon of Japonisme, it is important to acknowledge that Japonisme was not just an artistic phenomenon, but was steeped in the context of a Euro-American imperialist conquest of foreign cultures. Once entered the British market, Japanese objects were also given new meanings in art. The first opportunity the British public had for accessing Japanese material culture on a large scale was at the 1862 International Exhibition in London, where a Japanese court was organized and sponsored by British collectors. However, the majority of the display consisted of not only what were considered as industrial art according to a Western notion, so including ceramics, bronzes, lacquerware, and textiles, but also utilitarian objects such as the two prominently presented straw wrinkles and paper lanterns that you can see in this illustration. So these items formed a stark contrast with the fine art exhibits of other Western countries. Visiting the exhibition, a group of Japanese delegates expressed disappointment in the quality of the exhibits, which were disproportionate to the high expense. Unlike most British collectors at the time, they were privy to the fact that many of the objects displayed as specimens of traditional Japanese craftwork were actually recent manufactures sold for very high profits. In contrast, the English artist John Layton proclaimed the Japanese court the grandest of all displays, the most perfect the world has yet seen. This praise is particularly suggestive in light of the recent crisis of British decorative art due to Britain's rapid industrialization, which prompted many Victorians to seek an idyllic ideal in foreign cultures. Exhibited in a readily receptive environment, Japanese objects offered a vehicle for the collective imagination of a very quotation marked primitive Orient, a discourse of Japan that was oblivious to reality. So consequently, the culturally specific values and functions of these objects were obliterated as they entered British visual culture and became assimilated into local artist repertoire. The result is best illustrated in Whistler's The Balcony, in which figures wearing kimono pose in front of a distant Chelsea cityscape, which is identifiable through the landmarks I circled on another painting. In his famous 10 o'clock lecture, Whistler summarized, "The story of the beautiful is complete, hewn in the marble of the Parthenon and broidered with the birds upon the fan of Hokusai at the foot of Fushiyama," by which he meant the iconic Mount Fuji. Juxtaposing Japanese art with classical antiquity, he expressed a belief in art's universality, which celebrates art as a mythic entity that can seamlessly shift across contexts and straightforwardly transmit its meaning. However, by depicting Japanese objects as aesthetic motifs, Whistler simultaneously evoked Japanese culture and reconstructed it to realize his own artistic vision. In other words, disinterested in the inherent qualities of Japanese artifacts, Whistler appropriated them for their attached cultural ideals that affirmed his aesthetic philosophy and facilitated his artistic innovations. What resulted was the effacement of the specific material processes through which the objects were introduced to and understood by the British public. So to conclude, the case of Whistler shows that Japonisme involves not only artistic innovations, but also complex cultural politics. Therefore, it is necessary to recognize and closely interrogate the Japanese subject matters in paintings as material science that must be placed back into concrete historical contexts. While Whistler self-consciously obscured them as such in order to weave together a decorative pattern void of meanings, visual forms representing Japanese objects nevertheless point to the context of British imperialism, which framed the material as well as cultural exchanges. So an urgent task, what I think is an urgent task here is to repoliticize what the artist had aestheticized and raise awareness of Japanism's inseparable connection with 19th century imperial culture. By examining the relationship between Whistler's now canonical works of modern art and cultural appropriation, my presentation reflects on the way of subversively seeing so-called masterpieces from fresh perspectives outside the Eurocentric canon. It is very far from my intention to make people feel uncomfortable when they're trying to enjoy a nice painting. I'm just trying to suggest that there can be other possibilities of experiencing artworks, especially in today's globalizing art history, where viewers are encouraged to go against the grain of established patterns of thinking and consciously refocus on the visual forms in front of them. So this way, the Japanese objects in Whistler's paintings have the agency to problematize the traditional narrative, which glosses over imperial legacies which underlaid the artist production. So my narrative hopes to have shown that it's important to continuously explore new narratives and about artworks, however familiar they might already be to people, so that we can produce new knowledge and ensure the dynamism of the discipline. And with that point, I conclude my presentation. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much. That was a fascinating kind of deconstruction of Whistler's work in an exciting way. There are a few questions here, but I'd like to ask you first of all, and take advantage of my being the chair of this particular talk, to ask in terms you explained that about the politicization, about your desire to kind of politicize a little bit Whistler's inclusion of Japanese objects and artifacts and aesthetics within his work. But I wondered, in looking at the theme, considering the theme of resistance, would you say that there is a resistance going on here, perhaps either to the Western social understanding and the attitude or conquest of the East, or perhaps a resistance to Japan's ideas of modernization? I don't know if there's anything you can say about that.
I suppose what I'm trying to say here is that, like, people, especially students, because this event is for for students, that we can think in the pattern with a pattern of resistance, and then reevaluate established knowledge that we kind of take for granted nowadays. Because the way I conceived of the topic is because I really liked this painting, the Princess by Whistler. But then when I was looking at the objects, the porcelain, the kimono, and the fans, the screens, the folding screens in the painting, I realized that they are not really talked about, despite everything that has been written about Whistler's Japonism and his love, his admiration for Japanese culture. And I thought that was weird. So I mean, I think my presentation is to raise awareness of that point, of how people can think about how they can resist existing knowledge.
Yes, absolutely. Just to quickly also, you mentioned the model. Is it Spartoli, the surname of the model who was in The Princess?
Spartoli. I'm not sure how to pronounce that exactly.
Is she the white girl as well? Because there are some similarities in the way they look, and also similarities in the carpet. I noticed, apart from one little motif of a kind of flower in the middle, but they're very, very similar. Could it have been the same? Could it have been the same model in the same place?
No, the other model is Jo Heffernan, Whistler's Irish mistress. I mean, it's interesting because the princess, the first, there's a sketch for the princess, and the model was actually Jo, but I think there was something happened, and Whistler had to change the model. And I do think that he intended the two paintings to kind of to stand in juxtaposition, because they really look like counterparts to each other. Just one very Victorian version with a nice prim white dress, and the other with an elaborate kimono.
Well, they're beautiful. Thank you very much. A question here. In this period, I believe there was also a trend for chinoiserie. Were these intermingled in Victorian art and culture, or kept quite distinct?
I think, yes, they were kept quite distinct. And I'm not exactly sure, but I think chinoiserie came a little bit earlier than Japonism. So when Japonism reached its peak in Britain, at least, the trend for chinoiserie had already faded. And I think it had a lot to do with the political situation, with the military political situation in China, and also the more recent modernization of Japan. And I think those are really related to how the cultures were perceived in the West.
With that, with that kind of parallel of chinoiserie and Japonism, there's another question here. What is the significance and the inclusion of a porcelain vase in the Whistler painting? Because I imagine if it's blue and white, it may be more Chinese blue and white, or tell us.
I think, to put it simply, I think it's just because Whistler had a collection of porcelains, of Chinese porcelains. And I'm not exactly sure if this one is actually from his collection, but it's either his own collection or from a friend's collection. Because, yeah, his circle they were like really fascinated with porcelain, blue and white porcelain. And yeah, and back in the 1860s, as I was trying to explain, the Japanese objects were just new, they were unfamiliar. So the British, they just couldn't really tell the Chinese from the Japanese, and sometimes there was some confusion. So I don't think it signified that much in the painting to a Victorian audience.
Was it problematic, though, do you think, for him to have included the porcelain within the Japanese context? I mean, to us as, I mean, to you or to us as viewers.
That is my opinion, especially considering the title of the full title of the princess is The Princess from the Land of Porcelain. I mean, porcelain is more associated with Chinese culture, whereas lacquer work might be more associated with Japan. But then Whistler did not make that distinction. I mean, I'm not exactly sure if that
it's tricky. It's problematic, I suppose.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I mean, you can see how problematic that historical route is by just looking at the title.
Well, thank you very, very much for raising such interesting points. Oh, another question here. Thanking you again and saying how fascinating this talk was. Is there any information or thoughts on the objects with his mistress? And referring to the bear or wild animal carpet she is standing on in relation to the Japanism of the objects in the counterpart painting.
Okay, I don't know much about the white gold painting, and even less about the carpet. What I think I will say is that I'm trying not to read into that carpet, because there are so many interpretations that are just trying to take that as a symbolism of something that we can't really figure out unless we ask Whistler himself, which is not possible. And then that just resulted in way too many scandalous interpretations of the work. So I mean, I just try not to read into it.
So we're steering away from that one.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very, very much for this. It was a great talk, and also very beautiful slides and paintings to look at. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Now we're going to move on to an artist showcase, the first of two that we've got coming up. This is by S. Godfrey. Godfrey is an interdisciplinary artist and first-year PhD researcher at the University of Exeter and Bath Spa University. They work mainly with textiles, but like to tinker with circuits, 3D software, and DIY electronics. Godfrey's showcase is entitled Resistance as a Tension and the Categorization of Trans Artists Within Textile Studies. I leave it to you.
Hi, let me just share my screen. Get rid of that. Okay, can you all see this okay?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, great. Yeah, thank you so much for having me today. Thank you to the organizers and the other presenters. It's been super interesting. Yes, I have just started my second year of a practice-based PhD at the University of Exeter, and the current title of my research is Creeping into Myself, Smocking, Pleating and Folding as Transgender Orientation. The aim of my research is to establish the concept of creeping as a trans creative methodology, and using the etymological connection between the words smock and creep, which in Old Norse and English, smock means to creep into a garment. I use smocking and folding tools and techniques and abject materials to create interactive textile installations and wearable sculptures, usually with an accompanying digital element that plays with uncanny and glitchy underwater plants and environments. And there's also an etymological connection between smock and the old Germanic word for mucus and wetness. And whilst digital kelp and textiles might not seem like the most obvious materials to pair together, they allow me to create speculative environments that explore the construction of bodily boundaries and thresholds. So for the purposes of this presentation today, I wanted to talk about my work in the context of the following three areas of inquiry, using two examples of recent collaborative installation and performance works titled Love Letters to Watery Others and Kelp Reflection Room 2. So I'm thinking about abject objects as resistance, resisting the cis gaze, and resisting singular knowledge through collaborative partnerships and polyvocal techniques. And I'm thinking about these areas with regards to the wider question of how can creeping be used as a material language and theoretical position to resist the limitations of taxonomies within trans studies and transvisual culture studies within that, and the field of craft and textile studies. So abject objects, I work with abject, discarded, and unwanted domestic materials. And by that, I mean net curtains, bed linen, fabrics and materials that are traditionally associated with interior and domestic life. The net curtains in both these artworks have holes and stains, or they're frayed and ripped at the edges, although you can only really tell that by getting very up close to them. And they've reused these curtains in both installations that you can see on screen, and will repurpose them for future planned works, with the idea that the continued use adds to this sort of dirty, degrading state and further alters their context and intended use. And in this case, abject is taken not only as a state of degradation, but also in the way that Julia Kristeva writes about it, to mean a rejection or resistance to supposed fixed states and a collapse in meaning. So resisting the cis gaze. The scholar Mackenzie Walk talks about the cis gaze, as in cisgender gaze, as a desire for observation and investigation of trans bodies, especially with regards to trans women. And she talks about the idea that the concepts of a normative body are held together through surveillance and policing, and the cis gaze harbors an anxiety about the slippages and transformations between gender. And whilst there are multiple examples of trans artists using figurative depictions of their own bodies in their art as a way to convey lived experiences and defiant celebrations of self, I'm interested in resisting this gaze through abstracting and removing a recognizable body from the work, and the possibility this offers to creep through the urge to categorize trans artists. So through employing the method of sloppy craft, which prioritizes a messy aesthetic that highlights the handmade nature of the work alongside abject materials that show stains and traces of bodies, you can see that this work was made by someone, though they're not clearly represented in the work. Instead, the audience is invited to prioritize touch and move their bodies inside the work to interact with it, pushing the gaze away from the trans creator and onto a new bodily experience for the participants. So in Love Letters to Watery Others, I collaborated on a textile and digital installation with the performance artist Mars Loeffler. And together we created a leaky living room with hidden audio and visual work that encouraged the audience to put their heads inside soft sculptures to access the work. And there was also a series of events where Mars performed as their tentacular drag alter ego called Lametta Gorgeous, and took the audience on a creepy meditation where they were encouraged to reimagine their bodies as watery queer archives and rearrange their internal organs to exist in an underwater world that imagined queer and trans ancestry and evolution. So this piece, the Kelp Reflection Room 2, this employs a similar theme of an audience being invited into an installation to reflect inwards, though with less instruction. The space is designed for a single occupant to enter a textile tent and sit while surrounded by an ambient soundtrack and a pulsating underwater landscape that draws the participant into a creepy and unsettling ecosystem. And it's important to note that both these installations were created in collaboration with other non-binary and trans artists. And I worked with the artist Ro Roszinska, who created the digital underwater world for this piece. And this idea of relationships with other artists, tools, techniques, and methods as a way to discover a trans orientation or a trans way of being in the world resists the idea of singular narratives and knowledge production, both in terms of constructing oneself outside medical spheres, but also within the academic sphere. Creeping as a methodology encourages creation with and alongside other artists, materials, and tools as an attempt to dislodge hierarchies of knowledge whilst acknowledging the racialized and gendered context of the materials and tools, especially with textiles. And as I enter my second year now, I'm currently exploring this polyvocal approach to my research and looking to create a framework for discussing the relationship between my body, the materials, the tools, and my collaborators. And I'm going to finish this with some references that I use for my work and yeah, social media and all that good stuff. And thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much. That was a fascinating fascinating look, and thank you for sharing your work. That was a fascinating look into some incredible, would you call them installations or creative pieces?
Yeah, I think I'm going with installations at the moment. That's the
Environment,
closest thing
yeah.
I can find to describe what's happening.
Well, I for one really you look at prioritizing touch and experience, and I love the idea of creeping into a garment. I'm going to use that. But I wanted to ask you, just as a kind of art historian, that what about you say you kind of create, you emphasize the importance of getting away from the set way of discussing things and defining things and categorizing things, but what about sharing the experience and critical analysis in the positive sense, in telling people about something, or explaining an artistic act of creation? Is there a need for some kind of category or vocabulary, do you feel, for a broad form of art which challenges perceptions but also needs to be shared and needs to somehow be categorized in some way or have categorizations? What do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, it's such a good question, because I think that's currently such a topic and a source of kind of huge discussion at the moment within kind of transvisual culture. I think on one side, there are people saying, you know, to talk about this and to try and categorize it in some way really flattens it, because you have to then form some sort of framework or ways of saying this is what it is, and by doing that you lose people who may not fit into that. So traditionally, a lot of times when we talk about transvisual culture, it comes under the wider LGBTQ kind of umbrella and people feel that if you don't quite fit into those things, that's it, you get lost outside of it and we can't talk about you, or you get lost in the histories of time. So there's the answer. The short answer is I'm not sure. I'm not sure how to really
be able to share it, isn't it? I mean, and not be
exactly.
afraid of what you're going to say or not say, or possibly intimate by whatever words you choose clumsily.
Yeah. No, totally. And I think at the moment, as there's more and more interest in showing work by trans artists, especially in institutions, especially in art institutions, it's often not curated by trans artists themselves, which I think also leads a bit more to this. So perhaps a way of looking at it is to have more trans curators and art writers, of which there are lots around, to maybe talk
You're not
about that.
imposing a lens.
Yeah, exactly. So, but it's a very complex subject, obviously. So yeah,
Well,
very new.
How can people see your work? Have you got a website, or can you include that somehow in
Yes, I can pop it in the chat. I have Instagram and a website and all those things.
Brilliant. So yeah,
thank you so much.
Another question, could you talk a bit more about the use of sound or music in the installations? Where does it enter the conceptual scheme of the work as a whole?
Yes. Both these pieces have sound in them. And for me, I think it's about coming back to this idea of a speculative landscape or a speculative terrain, and really creating this kind of immersive experience, so that when you enter it, it's kind of on you at all angles and all sides. So you kind of have to, I don't know, become really lost or immersed into these ecosystems. And I think that's kind of where it came from. For one of the pieces that I used, all the kind of BBC sound archives, which I definitely recommend using, and the NASA archives of planetary sounds. So I really wanted to take from these kind of otherworldly spaces and bring it in to go with the textiles. And again, it doesn't sound like they really go together, but they weirdly do.
And another question, it's thank you very much. And there's an interesting parallel between your work and that of some Afrofuturist artists referenced by Echo, in that you have gone underwater. What is the significance of the underwater world for you?
Oh, that's a great question. I think this comes back to, I'm really interested in writing around queer and trans ecologies, which is also a kind of blossoming area of research at the moment. And this idea of naturalness is often leveled at trans people, that they're not natural, or you're not allowed to be in these spaces, you're not allowed to be in the outside, or there isn't a strong correlation between trans people and the natural world somehow. And so I think being able to create your own landscapes really gives you this kind of freedom to create spaces for yourself on your own terms, And I think it's a really interesting way of looking at kind of constructs of nature and naturalism, which are also weirdly socially constructed. So there is a strong parallel between the two, for sure. And I think the link with Afrofuturism is really interesting too. And I think it is creating your own spaces where sometimes you are being forced out of others.
Well, thank you very much for that. Please don't
so
forget
much.
to put your connections into the chat. The second artist showcase is by Victoria Berger. She's an artist with practice-based interdisciplinary PhD research at the University of Westminster, uses porcelain to interrogate ideological and material whiteness from an explicitly anti-racist position. She has a BA Hons in ceramics from the University of Westminster and an MA Art and Politics from Goldsmiths, University of London. Her showcase is entitled Stirring Up Whiteness as Anti-Racist Resistance. I leave it to you, Victoria.
Thank you. Can you see that okay?
Yes.
Great. Yeah, I'm Victoria Berger. I'm an artist and practice-based PhD researcher at the University of Westminster. And I just want to start by thanking both you, Sophie and Tom, for accepting my proposal and for all the work that you must have done to put this on. So I'm very grateful. And I'm also particularly grateful for the theme, resistance, art and visual thinking. I think it's always pertinent, but it's particularly a timely theme at the moment. And I do just want to bring in the current situation in Palestine. I think it needs mentioning, particularly in relation to my work, because what we're seeing there is a direct result of British imperial history, whiteness operating, and all justified by othering, as Echo was mentioning earlier. But I do think that the fact that art can help and resist in some way does help me to keep going. So yeah, that's sort of the context. That's why I'm hoping for some form of resistance through my work, I suppose. My aim is to think critically using the medium of porcelain about how challenging ideological whiteness can be an active tool for anti-racism. My use of the term whiteness refers not to skin color, but to a constructed racialized identity that is positioned as superior to others and has both material and social benefits, what Eduardo Bonilla Silva terms embodied racial power. And I see my research as a conscious act of resistance, subverting the traditional uses and language of porcelain, as it's consumed in the West, at least, in order to stir up the sedimented social practices of whiteness, as Chantal Mouffe puts it. I'm hoping that porcelain will operate as my crowbar after Ghana for the ideological labor required to resist and repel oppressive whiteness as we seek to achieve racial justice and equity. So why porcelain? The material history of porcelain is tightly entangled with the dark trajectory of European imperial expansion, colonial exploitation, and global racial capitalism. It's a huge history, and I don't have time to go into it here, but I hope that this image I've used here sums this history up. So in terms of its material qualities, porcelain is a bright white clay that is cherished for its purity, delicacy, and strength. And such values were particularly exploited by Hitler's favoured porcelain makers in their reproduction of idealised Aryan characters, such as on this slide here. Over the course of my PhD research to date, I've been experimenting with different ways of using porcelain to critique whiteness. These have ranged from making discrete objects for exhibition through to participatory events via performance and workshops. I'm going to show now a selection here, and I only have time to describe them briefly, but perhaps we'll have time for discussion about them. So this is very much a prototype, this piece. It hasn't been out in the world yet. It's called Weaponized Whiteness, and it's about how white women can weaponize their whiteness against Black people, particularly men, to potentially lethal effect, which has a long and sordid history. In 2020, Amy Cooper, the so-called Central Park Karen, called the police on Christian Cooper, who was no relation, who was an African-American man who was out bird watching in Central Park, and he'd asked her to put her dog on a leash. And the confrontation was videoed and went viral. So here with this piece, I'm using porcelain, but also the cliche of the snow globe to highlight how necessary it is to peel back the veneer of innocent whiteness to reveal its sinister motives. In this piece, I've used the white pith helmet as a trope of empire and employed the classic language of blue and white decorated porcelain to reference the type of high-value East Asian goods that elite Europeans obsessively collected during the long 18th century. And they did this to show off their prestige and mercantile success. And this was a wealth that was generated largely by enslaved Africans being worked to death on plantations in the Americas and the Caribbean. I've painted sugarcane, cotton blossoms, and barbed wire on the helmet. This work queries the strategy of using a beautiful object to explore a brutal history, which I think there's some similarities with the earlier presentation from Alicia here. So I'm wondering, does the allure of the object succeed in challenging the whitewashed nature of this history? These porcelain badges are embossed with the words "white but working on it." My hope is that people wear these badges as a way of provoking a conversation about acknowledging what whiteness actually means in terms of benefiting from an unearned advantage, and then perhaps starting to behave differently. I realize that wearing a badge such as this is a provocative gesture that only privileged people can actually risk doing, but that kind of underlines the point. It also raises issues about performative narcissistic allyship. Now, these images are documentation of a live performance I did using spoken word, a large handmade porcelain pot, and hundreds of porcelain eggshells. While speaking, I broke the eggshells with my bare feet and then knocked the pot off the plinth, and it smashed loudly on the floor. An example of the words spoken are: we tend to handle whiteness with care. We tend to tiptoe around it. But whiteness is not really fragile. Whiteness is power. Whiteness is privilege. Whiteness is oppression. Whiteness is a way of seeing, thinking, and acting in the world. Whiteness is a weapon. While very favorably received for centering whiteness in the right kind of way, this piece really made me consider my positioning in this research and the potential performativity of being the good white person. So my next tactic was to run a couple of workshops open to the public, but held at my university, that combined practical making with porcelain and a discussion of ideological whiteness. My aim was to create a safe space for people to share their experiences of white oppression from both sides of the power dynamic, and to reflect on how the systems that uphold it can be dismantled. Clay is a very therapeutic tool, and I think that getting our hands dirty, so to speak, did aid the tackling of such a difficult subject. This site-specific work uses handmade porcelain rice bowls to draw attention to Winston Churchill's role in the Bengal famine. A group of us gathered at the base of his statue in Parliament Square early this year. I gave each person a bowl and then invited them to take a handful of rice to put in it. While doing this, I told them of the tragic events of 1943, when direct orders from Churchill regarding the requisitioning of rice and the prevention of grain shipments led to the deaths from starvation of 3 million people in the Bengal province of British India. I'm again playing with the idea of a beautiful object conveying a brutal truth, but this time the object was used to animate a discussion. I feel this is a more constructive use of objects, exploiting sight and live engagement to make the links with ideological whiteness more tangible. Now, this is my most recent work, and I'm hoping with this to build on the use of porcelain as resistance to whiteness by using it as a vehicle for imagining a future free from the colonial matrix of power. So here I am thinking along the lines of Echo's kind of speculation. And this work is inspired by the work of artist-activist duo Sonia Lindfors and Mariam Abdul Karim. And they focus on the radical potential of decolonial dreaming as a restorative and subversive practice. They say, and I quote, we should all be dreaming radical decolonial dreams of common futures as a platform of soft resistance by making space for communal coexistence and radical dreaming. So this was the inspiration for a participatory dinner event I held recently, where I invited 10 guests to share a meal using decorated porcelain plates that I had made for each of them. Aimé Césaire and Ariella Aisha Azoulay both stressed the importance of retrieving marginalized voices and using poetry as a source of knowledge and revolt. On the plates, I have immortalized the words of diaspora writers, including Audre Lorde, Suzanne Césaire, Saidiya Hartman, Vanessa Kizule, and Nadella Faye. And here are a couple of examples. I'll just read their words. Vanessa Kizule, who's a poet, writer, and performer, take up space. Don't wait for permission or approval. The journey has been long, but now you can take up space in any way you choose. And then from Nadella Faye, who would we be if this box we live in had no sharp corners, but had instead smooth, undulating edges full of softness? Over the course of the dinner, we discussed our hopes for freedom from white oppression and what this means. And at the end, the guests took away their chosen plate. So this is where I am now with my research. And I'd really appreciate any chance to discuss what you think of it as a potential for resistance in these dark days. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Victoria. What a fascinating presentation showcase. And also considering how porcelain is often regarded as a kind of secondary art in looking at it in terms of fine art and in terms of art history, it's often perhaps not given its full full recognition as a very creative and powerful material. So thank you very much for that. I found that art as an act of resistance and ceramics as an act of resistance was very powerful. Just quickly to ask myself, what food did you serve on the plates? Was it did you consider that, or was it mainly the act of eating off the plate that was
that was very considered. I invited a young chef to come up with a menu. So I told her about what I was trying to do, the nature of my research, but the fact that we are using this event to think hopefully and positively. So she came up with a menu, a very, very, very delicious menu from around the world. So yeah, she brought in various different cultures, but she was thinking of areas that had been colonized by the British. So that came into the menu as well.
Well, that's wonderful, and I love the idea of presenting beautiful things that touched on awkward moments in history. Where can people find more of your work? Are you on social media? Would you mind posting it?
I'll put it in the chat, but yeah, it's just my name. I'm so bad at that part of it. I'll put it in the chat.
Please do, because I'm sure a lot of us will want to see that, and also to see how your work, because it seems to be quite a journey or a discussion that you're having with these different aspects, but also with your environment and your colleagues as well. So we'd love to be part or to learn about that. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely I feel like I'm producing lots of different strategies, and I'm trying to work out which are the most effective. So yeah, any feedback would be much appreciated.
There's a couple of questions here. One of them is asking if you record your performances on film, or just through still photographs.
I did with that performance, the alive one. I did and I've learned so much from this, because it was such bad footage that I had
live on the eggshell one. Sorry to quickly ask, is that the eggshell one?
The eggshells one, yeah. And the footage was so bad that I had to restage it. So those images you saw are from a kind of restaged one. And that really did make me think about whether, about live events or documentation, and can the work be purely the documentation? And then if the power is in the live event, where to stage those, where to hold those, because it was in a very, safe, enclosed bubble of the university, and still it was a terrifying thing to do. So it's like, if I if I want to do that, where can I take that and where can that have the most impact? There is the restage one is on my website. Yeah,
which you already put into the chat. Thank you very much. Another question. This was such a thoughtful presentation. I enjoyed your idea of objects to animate discussion, a rich conceptual gesture. But my question regarding Decolonial Dinner is where you place your own identity within the quotes of other women. How do you negotiate intersectionality?
Oh, that's really interesting. Something I'm trying to reflect on constantly through my research and through my methodology and all the things we have to do as PhD students in terms of my what I like to call integrity, but that's been questioned by someone. Yeah, this is why I did the performance, because I felt like I was still so much in the background, and that I needed to literally bring myself into the research, which is what I did with the performance. And then I had lots of reflections about, then does it become about me? You know, I get so many comments about you're being very brave doing this work, and it's not, you know, I'm not brave. So with the dinner, I was very much within it, as in inviting the guests, facilitating the conversation, but also trying to raise these voices that have been previously marginalized. And I like to think that I'm working with them, because I, you know, physically create the plates and then I use their words, and these are never going to be commercial objects. So I'm never, I hope, appropriating it in that sense, like that those plates are gifted. So I am consciously thinking of the work those women, they weren't all women, but majority women, were bringing to my gesture, which was very much an act, I hope, of generosity to try and create this space where people felt safe enough to talk about these some very traumatic personal experiences came up in that space.
Yes, it was a gesture, but also you're very much an author of the event, aren't you? I mean, in that sense, like a filmmaker, I suppose you're setting the scene and you're creating the environment for people then to act. That's fascinating. Thank you so much, Victoria. That was a wonderful presentation. Now we're going to have a lunch break for half an hour. We'll be doing some tests towards the end of the lunch break. And so from 1:30 to 1:45, we're going to be doing some tests. It's okay if you come back onto the platform, but otherwise do feel free to have 45-minute lunch break, and we'll look forward to seeing you again at 1:45. That's in 35 minutes. Thank up. Axel, would you like to share your screen and speak and make sure that it's all working?
Yeah, hi, am I audible?
You are, in the sense that, oh, hang on, let me just turn off the recording, because I don't think we need that.
Project The Eyes of Earth. Initiated in 2014, The Eyes of Earth is dedicated to documenting the gradual decline of the lake and its impacts on the local communities. Daryani juxtaposes the recent photos of the lake with older ones taken by her family, who owned a motel beside the lake in its heyday. I approach these photos as mnemonic practices that, by situating the lake's past in dialogue with its present state, create a space for expressing grief and discontent. Against the backdrop of the political context of Iran, I read these photos as bottom-up acts of resistance whose aim is to prevent the erasure of the lake's memory and its entangled history with the local communities. Before discussing Daryani's project, however, in more depth, I want to first address the dominant visual depictions of the death of the lake. Normally, Lake Urmia has a deep green color. When its surface water evaporates, the lake grows saltier, and as a result, the water turns red. Each year, the red water and the remaining salt flats attract many amateur and professional photographers to the region. As a result, there is a growing number of aesthetically pleasing photos of the dying lake circulating on the internet. A quick Google search shows the extent to which these photos dominate the visual memory of the lake, as you can see here as well. These visually stunning depictions of a state of eco-crisis are not unique to Lake Urumia. In fact, sublimity is a recognizable visual trope in photos that depict the sites of human-caused environmental hazards, such as industrial ruins, urban ruins, and landfills. This trend, however, has been met with criticism. Because these photos fail to mention the broader social and political systems of injustice that have created the sites in the first place, they are unable to evoke an adequate response in their viewers. The era of the environmental crisis, you could say, demands new aesthetic strategies that can position the viewers as political agents with the capacity to act and react rather than merely passive observers. In the case of Lake Urumia, while the aesthetically pleasing depictions of the dying lake might draw attention to its debilitating situation, they also contribute to the production of an image of the lake as isolated from the systematic acts of neglect that has led to the crisis in the first place. Here, we are faced with a critical question. If these photos cannot capture the violence of anthropogenic climate change, what is the appropriate visual language that can aptly respond to this moment of bioloss? And how can this language politically mobilize its audience to take action? Before delving deeper into this question and presenting Daryani's project as one potential answer, I would like to take a moment to look at the broader political context, which I think amplifies the urgency of this question even more. Lake Urumia's disappearance should be contextualized in broader discussions over the impacts of the climate crisis on a region highly vulnerable to droughts and water scarcity. Over the last decade, the issue of water scarcity has fueled several nationwide protests in Iran. As a result, environmental matters have gradually turned into highly politicized matters, leading to the occasional arrests and imprisonments of environmental activists. Official narratives about the situation in Lake Urumia often overemphasize the effects of climate change on the lake's shrinking, remaining silent about the state-sponsored damming projects that have caused water bankruptcy in this drought-troubled region. The normalization of the circumstances as a natural consequence of global warming prevents the emergence of formative spaces for expressing grief, rage, and discontent needed for taking costly but vital actions against the lake's desiccation. Simultaneously, the rising discontent in the area poses an increasing chance of social unrest and state-targeted protests. This has resulted in the rendering of local environmental activism as a threat to national and public security. In the absence of ample space for expressing discontent and frustration at the sight of the vanishing lake, it has become even more critical to find new strategies to raise concern. Art is often considered the last resort for calling attention to the situation. The Eyes of Earth is an ongoing photographic project dedicated to capturing the life and death of Lake Urumia. Daryani uses her subjective position as a member of the regional community to narrate the story of the lake in relation to the people whose livelihood depends on it. The project shows the extent to which the photo series reflects the artist's deep personal and communal ties with the lake. Here I have a quote from the project website in which the artist writes, "In this long-term ongoing personal environmental story that I started in 2014, I tried to demonstrate the impacts of the dying of Lake Urumia on my own family, ecosystem, and people living around it, to reflect the interconnectedness of humans and the environment. The vanishing of Lake Urumia is much more than an environmental hazard. It is an emotional wound in people's memory. For those who remember what this place once was, the lake is much more than a receding blue spot on the world map. It is part of our identity, and we can only hope that it does not vanish forever." As you can see, the loss of the lake is not merely a bio-loss. It leaves an indelible mark on the community's sense of distinct identity in a culturally and ethnically diverse country. It is in this context that I think remembering the lake as a source of life, rather than merely a shrinking body of water, gains political importance. As long as the lake is detached from the life of regional communities, the future of the region appears bleak. This decontextualization furthers a practice of social forgetting that threatens the sustainment of the local cultural identity. As much as remembering is what Jan Assmann calls a realization of belonging, forgetting can shatter a community's sense of selfhood. In this context, active remembering of the past becomes a countercultural practice against the erasure of the memories and identities of an ethnic minority. Thus, Daryani's photo series can be seen as a form of cultural resistance against the hegemonic narratives that, by detaching the lake's desiccation from its socio-political context, dampen its impacts on the regional communities. Daryani's family photos register the precarious memories of a landscape on the verge of disappearance. However, if they were once meant to capture a significant happy moment in the life of a family residing by the lake, their refashioning in a new context calls for a different affective response. For instance, some of the photos are a pastiche of earlier touristic photos that show the same spot at two different points in time. The confronting contrast evokes various emotions ranging from sorrow and grief to frustration and outrage. Indeed, for many of the locals, the sight of the vanishing lake and the endured bio-loss is grief-inducing. Grieving, as Judith Butler explains in Frames of War, is imbued with political significance. A grievable life, she argues, is a life that is worthy of mourning when it is lost. Rather than being neutral, however, the ability to name the grievable subject and mourn for its loss is highly charged politically. Open grieving, Butler suggests, and I quote here, is bound up with outrage, and outrage in the face of injustice or indeed of unbearable loss has enormous political potential, end of quote. Acts of protest against the vanishing of the lake can be seen as rituals of open grieving and public mourning that demand political mobilization. But what happens if there is no such political space for expressing grief, outrage, and public mourning? The importance of naming and mapping the entangled histories of the lake and the locals becomes even more apparent in light of this question. Daryani's photos illustrate the violence of stripping a grievable subject from its capacity to be counted as such. In one of the photos, which is also one of my favorites, the photographer's grandfather enters his abandoned motel beside a lake. A written text accompanies the photo. My grandfather's motel, which used to be perpetually busy, is now empty and ruined. In summers, even after the lake retreated, he fixed the windows broken by the wind as a habit. He always had the hope that those pleasant and crowded days would come back. He died in October 2018. I find a parallel between the return of the grandfather to the ruins of his guest house and the recalcitrant quality of the repressed memories of the lake finding their way into the works of art. The trauma on an individual level intersects with the cultural trauma on the collective level. As long as the grievable subject is refused its proper status, the past keeps haunting the present moment. Identifying a relationship between the ability to mourn and the ability to care in Grievable Water, Joshua Trey Barnett argues that, quote, grievability names an imagined future response to loss that animates care in the present, end of quote. I believe many of Daryani's photos are curated in a way to elicit such a response from their viewers. In a group of photos whose narrative revolves around the artist's grandmother, we can see this plea for care. In one, which you can see in the slide, she depicts her grandmother in her orchard surrounded by almond trees. In the next photo, we see the grandmother revisiting the same site in 2015, years after the first photo was taken. The orchard is in ruins, the almond trees are dry, and the village has almost disappeared. The grandmother's story comes to an end in an indexical photo of a plant pot supposedly belonging to her. In an ironic nod to the state's inability to tackle the crisis, the artist explains, "My grandmother loved trees and plants, and every corner of her house was filled with plants. She was an illiterate woman who knew the importance of the balance between humans and nature and managed to plant 800 trees during her lifetime. She died due to COVID-19 in 2020. Grief over witnessing the impacts of the lake's vanishing on the region fuses with grief over the loss of the grandmother, a prominent protagonist in the photo series. By mobilizing grief, the photos ask the viewers to engage in a practice of empathetic spectatorship that fosters care and responsibility and demands the right to mourn for the losses that the community has and continues to endure." To conclude, the rich cultural archive on which Daryani's project is built motivates a new narrative of the lake's desiccation, whose focal point is the locals and their deep-rooted relationship with the vanishing body of water. By situating the crisis in its socio-cultural context, the photos render its huge toll on the community's culture and sense of identity visible. Against the flux of photos that fetishize the lake's death, The Eyes of Earth offers a new pathway for capturing the violence of anthropogenic climate change. Refashioning and representing the past act as effective aesthetic strategies for portraying the connection between the lake and the local communities. Moreover, in bridging the gap between the past and the present, the photos function as tools of resistance that, in the political climate of contemporary Iran, open up an unofficial space for expressing grief and public mourning. These effective responses to a state of eco-crisis have the potential, I think, to instigate practices of care and mobilize people politically. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. I thought it was a really very poignant and it's a very timely subject. I've thought a lot in my own creative work about this concept of eco-grief and how it manifests and becomes much more prescient as time goes on. A question that I had was, I wonder, has there been any forms of resistance or protest or examples of mourning from within the community at quite a local level, rather than perhaps through iconographical or for photographic means? Is there that community base for this?
Yeah, actually, there has been. It's the community is very active in kind of raising attention to the issue through very different mediums. So, for instance, they had this protest. They have really like more traditional ways of protesting and demonstration, street protests. Or they even launched a campaign in 2016 called I Am Lake Urumia, which was supposed to kind of bring international attention to the issue because it's a really ongoing crisis. But a lot of these protests, unfortunately, are just being crashed. The beginning, the environmental issues were not really politicized that much, so it was easier to, just hold protests and kind of like to try to just say it's not okay. But as the issue of water scarcity becomes really like urgent and serious, also these protests are being highly targeted by the state. So it's not really easy to have this acts of open protest anymore, but still on the local level, it's very active. There are social media accounts, Telegram accounts, whatever, that try to raise the issue as well on the local level.
Which is very interesting when you consider the connections that, Mira was talking about in different forms of protest in Iran. I think there's a very interesting emerging body of work that's coming out of these, shared concerns. So yeah, I mean, thank you very, very much for your paper. And I think that now it's about time to move on to Aqsa Ashraf, who is a recent graduate of the MLit in Art History and is currently working as the Museums Collections trainee at the University of St Andrews. Her academic work focuses on South Asian colonial art history, and in particular the 19th century North Indian photography. And her paper today is entitled and forgive me if I pronounce this wrong, Nouch Girls and Photographic Violence, a study of native resistance in colonial photography. So whenever you're ready, Aksa, please take it away.
Thank you. I'm just going to share my screen now. I hope my PowerPoint presentation is visible.
Yes, it is.
All right, so thank you so much for inviting me to present this paper, and hi from St. Andrews. It was very sunny earlier this morning, but it has begun to get cloudy now. So yeah, before I go into details about the figure of the Nouch girl and resistance to photographic violence, I would like to give a brief background into why gendered representations are important in colonial art. So firstly, the idea of the oppressed native woman was very closely tied to the degeneracy of the colonial state. And in turn, the legitimization of colonial rule, and colonial empires were sustained through knowledge creation about the colony. And so indigenous populations were categorized into types created by the colonizer, and the colonized woman particularly becomes very important in this knowledge creation about the colony, because often things like costumes put stress on differences that were necessary for classification. At the same time, these ethnographic works dehumanize native populations by reducing them into types, into basically like objects for the white man's gaze, particularly like colonized women. And so the body of the colonized woman was at the same time a site of fetishistic obsession with the foreign, of legitimizing rule over foreign geography and people, and of maintaining that rule through knowledge creation. And all of these objectives were achieved through photography. So this this presentation is concerned with photographs of Nouch girls, and Nouch comes from the Hindi word Nach, which has its origins in the Sanskrit word Nritya, which means dance, and so Nouch girls were therefore dancing girls. And although they were merely a source of fascination for the British and early colonial India within subcontinental culture, Nouch girls were women with social mobility and cultural capital. And more importantly, they had been deeply involved in courtly politics. So these women were very politically active, and they were also involved in anti-colonial resistance, particularly during the revolt of 1857, which was the biggest anti-colonial movement in India in the 19th century. But it is important to note that there was no one type of Nouch girl. They had internal hierarchies and many layers of occupation, some of which included sex work. But colonial accounts often exaggerate their role as sex workers, and so they are presented as public women. And these ideas then came into conflict with Victorian social morality, and inspired movements like the late 19th century anti-Nouch movement. So on the one hand, the Nouch girl was an object of institutionalized fetish, and on the other hand, she was a mode of moral corruption for the colonial state. And so the Nouch girl, often merely by virtue of her existence, was at odds with the colonial order. This also reflects the Nouch girl's undeniable importance in Indian society, and therefore the need to be recorded by the colonial state, particularly in a post-1857 context. And so the question that I'm trying to answer is how the colonized woman, the Nouch girl, when anonymized or reduced to a type in a photograph, resist colonial authority. And in this presentation, I have looked at photographs of Nouch girls, and I've tried to read them for resistance through body language. I've looked at the composition of the images through primary literature about these photographs. And so the first two photographs that I will be discussing are from volume 1 and 2 of the volume 2 and 3, I'm sorry, of the People of India series, which was an extensive ethnographic work undertaken by the British after the revolt of 1857. And these photographs are accompanied by text, which, apart from morally policing their profession, go into detailed descriptions about the Nautch girls that are photographed. So the color of the Nautch girls is eyes, their hair, their costume, even their complexion is described. And the text that accompanies the photograph that you see on screen gives very detailed description of Zahor Begum, who is depicted, her jewelry. And this raises a question about whether her costume is a careful arrangement. So she is decorated to speak, as Malika Lula writes, of excessively bejeweled Algerian women in colonial photographs. Or can we read the emphasis placed on jewelry as the sitter as evidence of a profitable career despite colonial attempts at regulating the Nautch girls as profession? And like Algerian women in colonial portraits, the Nautch girl here refuses to smile for the camera. And Zahor Begum covers her her chest with her hands, and she has an expression of disinterest, whereas Waziran looks directly and inquisitively at the camera. And the letterpresses that accompany these photographs discuss the lack of respect that is associated with their character. And this perhaps seeks to universalize views about Nautch girls, but Zahor Begum and Waziran both look unfazed by the camera's presence, which perhaps indicates that they had been photographed before, which could throw light on their popularity as individual Nautch girls and therefore agency in self-determination as women who transgressed ideas of colonial morality. But this also raises questions about how resistance can be read in photographs of Nautch girls where they don't directly engage with the camera. And such a question can be analyzed through an 1887 album, which contains photographs of North Indian cities. It was compiled by various British photographers, and one of the photographs in that album is a photograph of the Nautch that we see here. This was most likely taken by Charles Shepard in Delhi, and scholars have argued that this album's owner had maybe never seen a Nautch in person. And so Shepard was probably only able to photograph this gathering because these are Nautch girls of a lower order. And he would not have been able to take photographs of well-to-do Nautch girls. And so therefore he is conjuring a fantasy of a gathering that he would perhaps not be able to witness. And secondly, when we compare this to architectural views, the idea behind the Nautch girls photographed is also perhaps to present an Orient frozen in time. This photograph has striking similarity to Tilly Kettle's Dancers, and it was most likely staged. But what is interesting about the photograph is that people peer at the photographer from all corners, and the most striking is the man that we see who looks directly at the camera and has an expression of disapproval. And so Shepard is freezing a temporal moment to create several layers of voyeurism. The native men and women watch the Nautch girls, and then all of them are meant to be watched by white men a continent away. But the attention of the colonized subjects is actually towards the camera and perhaps at the photographer instead of the Nautch girls. So when the photograph was taken, the white man is the object of the colonized people's gaze. He is the spectacle and the other. This makes one question if the frozen temporal moment is about the Nautch girls being watched by a group of natives, or is it about the natives watching Shepard create a fantasy about them? And that raises the question whether this imbalances existing power relations between the colonizer and the colonized. But South Asian photography also provides instances of resistance where resistance is less subtle. So this is evident in Samuel Burns' writings about his experience of photographing Nautch girls in Kashmir. Burns records that summers in Kashmir provided the ideal weather conditions to take photographs, but his biggest obstacle was the obstinacy of the natives when he wanted to take pictures of them. the colonized subjects were always stiff and uncomfortable in front of the camera. And he argues that this prevented the photographs from looking lifelike. So he writes that he ordered the English commissioner in Srinagar, and I quote, to have the best looking Nautch girls collected for him to photograph, but much to his dismay, the Nautch girls, and I quote again, were very shy at making an appearance in daylight and absolutely refused to move an inch for the purpose of posing. The Nautch girls in Burns' photographs, seated on the carpet, are arranged to resemble Orientalist paintings of harems full of women lounging on carpets and meant for a voyeuristic gaze. These women are presented as public women, but unlike in the harem painting, these Nautch girls look directly at the viewer. None of them is smiling for the camera, which indicates that they do not invite a conversation. Furthermore, some don't allow more than their faces to be seen. They hide their hands in the folds of their garments, and they appear shapeless. So despite Burns's attempts at seeing them in a way that they don't see themselves, which is public and unveiled and sexually available, the Nautch girls want to be photographed and seen on their own terms. The Nautch girl remains an integral part of popular post-colonial imagination, particularly in cinema, which often furthers colonial tropes of hypersexualizing them. So photo series like Pushpamala N's Native Women of South India are significant in challenging colonial and post-colonial ethnographic sensibilities. This work was made of 4 sets of over 250 photographs, and where Pushpamala and she acted as the protagonist in a performance that explores, and I quote, the history of photography as a tool of ethnographic documentation. This was a process-oriented series, and the costumes that were used were borrowed from different people across caste and religious lines, which challenges colonial generalizations of Native womanhood. And the photo series is relevance in the discourse around Nautch girls because historically Nautch girls were not operating cameras. They were only being photographed by a white male anthropologist photographer. But Pushpamala N in her photo series is both the exotic other and the anthropologist. The Nautch girl resists her colonial categorization by a white man, whereas Pushpamala N takes complete agency in how she wants to be defined and photographed. Colonialism, as we know, is a violent exercise, and violence is not always inflicted explicitly. I can't really go into more detail about this because of the time constraint, and also this is very much a work in progress, and I realized through my research that I have a lot more questions than I have answers. But I would like to conclude by saying that colonial photographic violence did not disappear with India's independence. Photographers like Steve McCurry keep dehumanizing photographic tropes alive. Their portraits anonymize people of color, and they are explicit in their nostalgia for a non-existent Orient. But resistance to oppressive regimes is a historical fact, and resistance can take on many forms, some of which I hope I've been able to demonstrate through my paper. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's a very, very interesting paper that touches on a range of themes. I mean, I've just got a very quick question to jump into just out of my own curiosity. Just wondering where the beginnings of this research project came from. I'm wondering how you came to found this very interesting subject. Was it working in the museums? Was it your sort of MLIT research? I'm just curious about that.
Oh, well, most of this actually comes from growing up watching movies about Nautch girls.
Wow, okay.
So in Indian cinema, they're often romanticized, but also like hypersexualized. So this is something that I just grew up sort of like interested in. And because of all like colonial ideas of Victorian morality and whatever you still see in post-colonial times. So today, Nautch girls are sort of, they're associated with they're not very respectable, and that is something I grew up listening to in my family. which was very middle class, very influenced by Victorian ideas of Victorian morality. And I think that is sort of what got me interested in looking at resistance and actually finding out more about them.
That's really, really interesting. Thank you. We've got a question here that goes, thank you so much. These images and this topic are extremely touching. Perhaps I missed your mentioning what was the status of Nautch girls in their own society. You mentioned inexplicit violence. Were the white male colonial photographers entering non-male environments to take these pictures?
So Nautch girls, they operated in very sort of like non-heteronormative households. So there was in like a Nautch girl household, you would have certain women who would be like who would venture out into public spaces, and other women who would live in secluded spaces. So women who, for example, took on this profession were would perform for the public, but they were very selective about the public that they performed for. So sorry, and the second part of the question was whether the white male colonialist photographers were basically like invading these spaces. I don't think they were necessarily invading these spaces, because as I mentioned, the photograph that was taken by Charles Shepard was probably of a Nautch of a lower order, of like Nautch girls of a lower order. So they were probably like performing for like the general public, but there were also Nautch girls who could be very selective about who they would perform for. So they would maybe only perform for royalty or certain families.
I see.
So I think like that the photograph that he took was of a gathering that he would be allowed to sort of witness, but there would be similar gatherings which he would not be allowed to witness as like a white colonialist photographer.
And something that struck me, there was, I think the images towards the middle of the presentation that I thought were particularly powerful was when you see the subject looking back. And I loved your point about making the photographer the subject now. And it brings in this wider question that I wonder if what it is what you're suggesting, or whether you have any thoughts on the idea of the camera of photography in this particular context being quite literally now, through what you're describing in the research, and how we now should read these as something inherently fantasy building as a concept. I mean, is that something that you are making this claim on?
Not necessarily. I think we should read photographs like this, and that is what I did for this photograph through, for example, Roland Barthes' idea of the studium and the punctum. So the studium is like what the photographer is actually trying to portray, but if you look closely, you see like these little, the punctum basically is what tricks you about the photograph. And so you see things that the photographer did not intend to be a part of the photograph, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think it's very interesting taking that idea of the studium being something that also is a cultural and contextual, the visual culture that we inhabit and are brought up with. And I think now, as time goes on, it's a really interesting way in which to reframe how studium and punctum could work in these things. Now we've got this heightened awareness of these colonial practices and legacies, and how it could change our interpretations of these photographs. But yeah, I think I don't see any more questions, and that's perfect timing, I think. So I'd like to thank you again for your wonderful paper. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And finally, last but very much not least, we have Daniel Canso, who is a doctoral candidate in political science and international affairs and public policy at the University of Georgia. In 2020, he co-founded the estate of Nabil Canso, his late father, which acts as the central repository for artworks and archival materials created over the course of the artist Nabil Canso's prolific 6-decade career, and to advance the visual arts and culture globally through the preservation, exhibition, and publication of his work. He'll be presenting a Pecha, which is entitled Reading Nabil Canso's 6 Decades of Visual Thinking. And I will just get the presentation which I hope we can all see. You'll have to tell me if you can see this now, because I'm the one sharing. But I assume
We can
all
see
is
it.
well. Great. Let me just get a timer up, because this is a different format. Okay, so whenever you're ready, Daniel, please take it away and I will start timing.
Thank you so much, Tom, and thank you to all of us joining us this afternoon. It's really a pleasure to present this work to you and to discuss the estate of my father, Nabil Kantso. And given the time restraints, we will be very brief and primarily present the work through the visual display, looking at about 18 of his works through 6 decades. And so Nabil was born in 1940 in Beirut, Lebanon, where he was raised. And in 1958, in the first iteration of the Lebanese Civil War, his school was shut down due to the fighting. And so that was the point at which Kantso decided to leave Lebanon to go continue his studies in London, really to be able to finish his education, as that conflict was actually the first instance in which U.S. ground troops arrived in the Middle East. It was really formative for him. He studied in London for about 5 years before beginning his career in New York, as he went to attend New York University. Very quickly, he became immersed in the art scene there. Vietnam was a big issue that really shifted his practice into activism. And so from that point forward, really, he spent the next 5 decades bearing witness to social, political, and cultural developments. You'll see this is a 4 by 7 meter mural. And then very quickly after, we saw the beginning of the Lebanese Civil War in 1975. At that point, Kantso journeyed back to Lebanon. He had started a studio in New York that had closed. This you might recognize as the display image. This is one of his earliest works on the Lebanese Civil War. And you can see he's trying to put you in the framework of the conflict. As Kantso went forward, he wanted to make his practice more globally accessible, started reaching. You'll see this work entitled 49 Seconds, and that's a reference to the dropping of the atomic bomb over Hiroshima. This is also a very large work, about 3 by 5 meters, and the intention is to create these life-size figures to put you at the center of the conflict. Literature was also a focus of Kantso. So you'll see here the story of Faust, who of course famously made a deal with the devil for pleasure on earth, and kind of a bet between the devil and God, where of course the devil won out. And so it was also diving into these very deep literary subjects, relating them. Here, a work entitled Time Suspended in Space, that was created in 1980, at the beginning of Kantso's career in Atlanta, where he moved and established the studio where he'd then work for over 3 decades. This work is focused on apartheid in South Africa, which was, of course, continuing on through the 1980s, a real stain on the world. And Kantso also, interestingly, as he framed his work, he tried to capture both the before, the after, and what could be. Not only focusing on sort of the horrors of war, but also trying to show, the other things in humanity. And so this is a work entitled The Precipice, that sort of shows what Lebanon was like before it descended into such a deep and painful conflict. You'll see a lot of very bright colors in his work, and this is kind of the other side of that. A work entitled Endless Night, also focused on the Lebanese Civil War, where you'll see much darker hues, a darker color palette, sort of a real scene of fire and devastation. You'll see animals often incorporated into Kantso's work, making that connection between the natural world and sort of what humans have wrought. Here is a work focused on Othello. This was the subject of great controversy. Kantso staged this show in 1985 in Atlanta in the Deep South. Unfortunately, most of the paintings were removed after about a day of exhibition. There was a lot of local outcry, where he sort of very viscerally depicted this relationship between a Black man, a white woman, sort of diving into those deeper social themes. As Kantso's style evolved, you'll see sort of other allusions to historical themes mixed with the references to ongoing conflicts. You'll see the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse in the back of this painting, part of a series called Cluster Matter Floating in Spaces of Shades, that attempts to show sort of the disintegration of humanity. This painting harkens back to the historical practice. You'll see on the right side, Abraham Lincoln, on the left side, Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson, North-South split, a reference to the US Civil War. This is a painting that we're very proud will be on display at the High Museum in Atlanta beginning next month. And really marks a very big return into that institution and into institutional arenas. Kuwait was a big influence on him. The war, the Gulf War. And he was the first artist to show in Kuwait after the Gulf War. That exhibition also traveled to the Museum of the Red Cross in Geneva, and you can see here the burning of the wells depicted. Another work from the Kuwait series, The Confronting Mother. These tend to be a much smaller format. So this is 20 by 24 inches. And you can see here kind of a close scene of a mother clutching her child. And a prominent feature is sort of the works are meant to lock eyes with you, to bring you in, help you understand sort of that deep human emotion that's being experienced. Another literary reference, a series based on Edgar Allan Poe's The Raven, created in 1995. Here you can see a different element of Canso's work. These are watercolors on paper, but you can see many of those same allusions. Of course, The Raven, Edgar Allan Poe, and so Canso's work, you'll see sort of the height of the very large paintings is in the 80s, the early 90s, some in the 70s, and then Canso's practice sort of shifts to smaller formats. Leaves from the Theater of War is a tragicomedy of over 250 works on paper designed as a book, and so here you can see one of those drawings. As Canso went into the 90s, he sort of developed these series, America and the Holocaust series, also called Unforgotten Memory. The series was completed in 1994. You can see very intense, large-scale images focused on the experience of the Holocaust, helping to sort of share that memory. The war in Iraq had a very profound effect on Canso as an artist who was living in the American South, practicing, and who faced a lot of discrimination and challenges in his own career. So this was a very important series. You'll also see a little bit more abstraction show up in some of these later works, trying to show, again, both the before and the after. The refugee crisis created by the war in Syria, the civil war there, was also profoundly impactful on Canso as it impacted countries across the region, including Lebanon. This is a work called Escape and Fleeing, produced in 2016. You can see the ladders, the boats, the allusion to refugees fleeing their homeland with nowhere to go, and the diaspora. And finally, the last series that Canso created was focused on mass incarceration in the United States. So this is a work entitled Full House from 2018. Canso passed away in late 2019, was really working until the very end of his life. And it was very important to him to call attention to injustices, both global, domestic. Of course, the scourge of mass incarceration is a very important issue in the United States. And so you can see this is a work on paper, also a bit of a smaller format than some of those earlier works. So I know that's a very brief format, a lot to take in visually, but this just gives you a glimpse of some of the issues that Canso focused on in his activist practice, bring attention to some of these very critical issues, both globally and in the United States.
Wow, what a whirlwind. Fantastic stuff. Thank you so much, Daniel, for that. Some really, I love the general style of the artwork. I think it's so impactful, really, really visceral artwork. We've got a quick question here. Thank you for this incredible and personal insight into the work of an amazing artist. Where can we see more of his work?
Absolutely. Well, we're really excited that the work of the estate has led to many instances of scholarship and exhibitions that will be starting to prop up. And so some of those include an installation that will go up at the High Museum in Atlanta in December. Will continue to be on view for several months. There is a show that actually our earlier keynote speaker, Rachel Winter, is curating at the Broad Museum in Michigan that will be set to go live in February of 2025. That is a sort of a bit of a retrospective that will show works ranging from the 60s all the way to the 2010s, be able to give a glimpse of his career, and then also call attention to a biography that will be released early in the spring of 2024, authored by Miriam Sultan and produced by AMCA, the Association of Modern and Contemporary Art of the Arab World in Turkey, where several scholars have dedicated themselves to putting forward what is the first scholarly biography after Canso's passing. And so that is sort of the first major scholarly work that will be released, and we're hopeful that many others will follow, and certainly hoping that there will also be an opportunity to bring his work back to the UK as well.
There's a follow-up question to that, asking, did he have an archive of information? Did he interview people to research these images? I'm assuming whether that's in reference to the biography and publications that are coming out.
So he was very engaged with other artists. He actually often would send his works to world leaders, making appeals for peace, and that extends all the way from, Nelson Mandela to the state of Israel, many others, where he was trying to use his work to appeal, to sort of motivate them to see, the ridiculousness of some of these conflicts, the deeper humanity that we share. And actually, one of the very interesting things about this artist is he was, very much an outsider artist to really a radical degree, where actually he refused to sell his work throughout his entire lifetime. He'd often call his work his children. And so a big part of his practice was actively archiving, working to create sort of venues online, working to share his work through publications. He had many exhibitions, but they were really focused institutionally in nonprofits, things like that. And so that is one of the challenges of the estate, where we're working sort of to place his work to make it more accessible so that it can be seen. And he had a very wide range where he was producing works really in a very universal way that touched so many places across the world, trying to appeal to that shared humanity. And so it is a big task for the estate. There's a lot of work that we're doing ongoing, but we really do try to be as collaborative as possible with scholars, curators, and to get the work where it can be seen.
I've got a question regarding some of the works and its general. I think it seems to be a theme of his practice as he went on, is this idea of intertextual reference to literary works in particular. And I'm wondering whether there was a specific, was the intention to use them in a subversive way, or what was the sort of intertextual interaction that was going on here? Was it purely an inspirational homage type thing, or was there a more quasi-political undertone to it?
I think, certainly there are those undertones. Bearing witness is a very important part of his practice, and something where he would incorporate, many historical references. Some of these paintings would be in progress for, up to 3 years, really intense, paintings that would take a lot of research and work, make a lot of historical references. But also, something that I'd point out is this is an artist who grew up in Lebanon in an era between, the 40s and the 60s, where there were very few institutions. There were really no museums to speak of dedicated to contemporary and modern art. And so for him, as he traveled across, the UK, across Europe, the States, became familiar with the Western canon, it was also very important to him to try to translate these sort of great contributions to history to make them more accessible to people who otherwise might not be exposed to them, and sort of provide an entry point to see, this dive into what does humanity mean? What binds us together? What is the root of, these very deep themes, from sort of sexuality to power to war, and sort of using this as an entry point where it's very visual, it's very large, you see life-size figures often. And so it's part of the intention is sort of to draw you in, to expose you to something that you might otherwise not see, particularly in parts of the world where they, that might be a bit more tough to access.
Fantastic. There's a couple of other comments, not questions, but just saying it's brilliant subject and presentation, and powerful history painting, wonderful. But I think that brings us neatly to the end. So I'd like to thank you again. That was a really wonderful paper, very invigorating. And I hope to see more of Canso's work in the future.
So thank you.
Thank you. And I think that takes us to the end of Global New Voices 2023. I'd like to thank everyone who's contributed to the day. I think it's been really wonderful. So many different themes, topics, all of which have a sense of urgency and importance about them. And I think it's a real testament to all of you who have presented and engaged with the programme, that you're doing such important and timely work. And I think we'd both like to thank you for participating in Global New Voices this year. I don't know if you've got anything to add, Sophie?
Thank you very much again to everybody. Also to remind you that we are members of the DECR committee, and we're always looking for new committee members. So if you'd like to come and take part and help develop events such as this, and there's a busy schedule with professional development days and summer symposiums and reading groups and all that kind of thing, do look us up on the Art Association for Art History website, or you can email, is it DECR at
Yes.
forarthistory.org.uk. We can put that in the chat now. Could you possibly, Tom? And we'd love you to join us on the committee. I think that's it from me, and have a wonderful afternoon.
Oh, sorry, I've just sent that to you, Sophie, not everyone. But yes, thank you, everyone. I will just pop that in the chat. Great. Thank you, everyone.